Good morning. Welcome you to the 13th meeting of the Public Audit Committee of 2013, and I welcome members of the committee, press and public to the meeting. I have no apologies. Can I ask those present to make sure that mobile phones are switched off, or at the very least made to put onto the silent mode? Thank you. Can we agree, item 1, can we agree to take items 5, 6 and 7 in private? Thank you. Item 2, we have a section 23 report, Scotland's Colleges 2013, which is obviously an issue which has been of considerable interest over the last year or so, and I think this is a tedious report, so can I invite the Auditor General, Caroline Gardner, to brief the committee?
Thank you, Convener. As the committee is aware, we published a report in October last year which assessed the financial standing of Scotland's colleges immediately before structural reforms and planned public sector spending reductions took effect. The report also summarised progress towards the establishment of 13 new college regions, with the intention at that time of establishing a position against which the progress of the reforms could be measured later. In August this year, we published an update report which covers colleges' financial standing in the academic year 2011-12 and how much learning they delivered. It also summarises the college sector's recent progress towards regionalisation and examines some of the key issues that colleges are likely to face in the coming years. We found that the overall financial standing of the college sector continued to be generally sound. Colleges reported an overall operating surplus of £2 million, compared with an overall deficit of £29 million in 2010-11. But most colleges continue to operate to tight financial margins, where the amount of the surplus or deficit is rarely more than 3% of their income. Some colleges do appear more financially sustainable than others, but there's often no discernible pattern in their ability to achieve a surplus from one year to the next. Colleges' income has fallen in recent years, and this will continue for the foreseeable future. A £56 million real terms reduction in Scottish Funding Council grant funding contributed to colleges' overall income falling by 9% between 2010-11 and 2011-12. The Scottish Government has announced budget increases for colleges totalling around £130 million since 2011, but colleges still face an 11% real terms cut in revenue funding between 2011-12 and the end of the current spending review period in 2014-15. Some college regions will face larger reductions in fundings than others and will therefore have to reduce their costs more. Colleges achieved their sound overall financial position by reducing spending, mainly on staff. Between 2010-11 and 2011-12, there was a net reduction of around 1,200 full-time equivalent staff, with most reductions in teaching staff, and colleges reduced their recurring staff costs by £56 million in real terms. Staff costs form about 60% of a typical college's spending, and it's therefore understandable that reducing their staff numbers is the key way in which they're making savings. However, it does create risks, and it's important that colleges retain the right skills and experience they need to maintain the quality of education they deliver. Moving on to regionalisation and reform, most colleges are currently either merging or forming federations with other colleges to create 13 new college regions. These structural reforms are aimed at helping colleges to better meet local needs for further education and to make savings through increased efficiency. This restructuring represents a major change for the sector, and colleges aim to complete the process as planned by the end of 2013. The total number of colleges will reduce from 37 in 2011-12 to just 21 by the end of this year. The Funding Council is providing around £54 million to help fund regionalisation. Colleges are expected to meet up to half of the total costs of individual mergers, but the amount that each college will contribute varies widely. The costs of recent and current mergers are still to be finalised, but the Funding Council expects the reforms to generate around £50 million in savings each year from 2015-16 onwards. We will monitor colleges' progress in achieving these efficiencies and the other benefits that are planned from the reforms. We'll also continue to monitor the sector's progress towards other aspects of structural reform, including the further development of the outcome agreements that set out what colleges are expected to do in return for Funding Council funding. Colleges continue to meet their annual targets for providing education, but an increased emphasis on longer courses has led to reductions in the total number of students who attend college. In line with government policy, colleges are placing an increasing emphasis on full-time courses and prioritising education for younger students. This may limit learning opportunities for older people and other groups who prefer to study part-time. It's therefore important that colleges monitor the demand for places to help meet both national priorities and local needs for further education. Finally, following a decision by the Office for National Statistics, all colleges in the UK will be reclassified as public bodies from 2014. This will require Scotland's colleges to operate within the same system of annual budget limits as other Scottish Government bodies. This in turn will restrict colleges' ability to build up financial reserves. The Scottish Government and the Funding Council are currently engaging with the college sector to investigate ways of minimising the impact of reclassification on college finances. I make a number of recommendations in the report to the Scottish Government, the Scottish Funding Council and to colleges about what needs to happen to help the sector address the future challenges. This includes monitoring progress in achieving savings and the other benefits from mergers to help with financial planning, assessing and managing the impact of reclassification on the financial standing of colleges, identifying risks to future capacity, such as their ability to meet learning needs in the context of reduced staff numbers and to mitigate those risks where necessary, and finally monitoring the impact of prioritising younger students and full-time courses on the opportunities for older people and other groups, taking appropriate steps to address their needs where that's necessary. Convener, I intend to produce future reports on progress with reform to allow the committee to keep oversight of how this important policy initiative from the government is progressing. But for now, my colleagues and I will be happy to answer any questions the committee may have.
Okay, thank you very much. That's very helpful, and I think it is helpful that there will be a regular look at this significant issue. Can I clarify a couple of figures that you mentioned? You said that in 2010-11 there had been a reduction in income of 9%, and then for the period between 11-12 and 14-15 there would be a reduction of 11%. Is that 11% real terms reduction on top of the 9% real term reduction?
I'll ask my colleagues to clarify that for you, Convener. You're right, it is a complex picture with a number of shifts over the last couple of years. I'll ask Phil to respond to that question on my behalf.
The 9% is the 1 year difference between the 2010-11 and 11-12 figures. The 11% reduction is the difference between 2009-10 to 11-12, so it's a longer period, and that explains the larger reduction.
Right, okay. Thank you. You say in the report that at paragraph 25, a lack of cash can be an indicator that an organisation has financial problems. We therefore asked the auditors of Reed Care and Barony College for their view on the college's cash position, and the auditors said that the colleges normally operate to tight margins and there were no significant concerns over the college's financial stability. Two parts to the question. Have you had any expressions of concern about the funding position of any colleges in Scotland over the last year, 18 months?
I'll ask Graham to pick up the specifics of the question, if I may, Convener, but I think it's important to be clear what the cash and cash equivalence figure means. It is only a snapshot at a particular point in time, the final day of the financial year, and the auditors of all of the bodies for which I have responsibility are asked very specifically to make a judgment about whether they think the body involved is still a going concern. So we've got two tests going on there. I'll ask Graham to pick up the question about financial pressures.
I don't think we've had any indication that any one college is in significant financial concern, financial trouble at the moment.
The question wasn't about significant. I just asked if you had any expressions of concern at all about any colleges.
No. No.
Right. Okay. And just before I bring Mary in, on that same page at paragraph 24, you talk about Scottish Funding Council good practice minimum of 60 days cash, and again, you know, Reed Care and Barony are mentioned with less than 1 day. Now, if that's not an issue, if it's not a concern, then why does the Scottish Funding Council have that? as a good practice standard?
The 60 days is really to give colleges a certain amount of leeway in managing their cash and the timing of their income coming in and paying their bills. Specifically in relation to Reed, Kerr, Barony and Carnegie, because these colleges had so little cash at the end of the financial year, we went back to the auditor specifically to ask about how these colleges operated. Now, in the case of Carnegie, it was fairly clear from the accounts why the college did not have a lot of cash. In the case of Reed, Kerr and Barony, it was less obvious, and there was a history of the college not having, these colleges not having a lot of cash at the end of the year. But that's basically the way they operate, according to the auditors, and the auditors didn't express any concerns about that. Fundamentally, there potentially is some questions about how these colleges manage their cash position. And I think under the circumstances that these colleges find themselves in, they really have to pay quite close attention to their cash flows and the timing of when they're receiving money and when they're paying their bills. Now that, generally speaking, is all manageable. The risk is if there is a mismatch, such that at any one time, timing differences means that the college runs out of cash, in which case they would probably have to have recourse to their overdraft facilities, and that can be expensive, but if it's only for 2 or 3 days, that is manageable. I think if that was a routine thing, that they were having to borrowing to support their day-to-day activities, then that is something which we would not encourage. Generally speaking, borrowing to support capital investment is often a good thing. Borrowing to support day-to-day operational activities is rarely a good thing. But neither of these colleges are in that situation, so we are fairly comfortable with the way they are operating.
I suppose we can ask the Scottish Funding Council why it has a 60 days minimum good practice standard, but from your perspective, given that clearly it's not been adhered to, is it of any value having a 60 days minimum standard if it really doesn't matter that much? Is there a point to it?
It's guidance. Some colleges, because of the way they operate, are able to generate cash.
What I'm asking you is there any point to it?
Convener, I think we all feel, as accountants and auditors, that any public body needs to manage its liquidity, the amount of cash it has available to meet outcomings as they fall due in the way that Graham's very ably described. And the guidance is the only way really you can put forward what good practice looks like. Everybody's circumstances are different, and the risks that they're running are different depending on their ability to borrow. 60 days is the Funding Council's rule of thumb, but it can be no more than that. The same's true of the liquidity ratios that are often used in the private sector to look at how liquid companies are.
I just wanted to ask a supplementary on the point the convener made about the 11% fall in funding between 2010-12. I'm looking at Exhibit 8 on page 18, paragraph 31, and the fall in teaching, which is, the ability to offer courses and deliver education and training. The fall in teaching in those 2 years is 69 million, which, as I understand it, is teaching staff costs decreased by 16%. So the figure you gave to the convener was 11%. Was that for overall college funding, taking into account administration and catering and residential? But it's the actual teaching that I think is critical. And can you just confirm that the fall in teaching was 69 million in 2 years, a fall of 16% in colleges' ability to teach? Is that correct?
We say in paragraph 31 above the exhibit, Ms Scanlon, that the teaching staff costs reduced by 16%. I don't have the figure to hand, but 16% is certainly the correct percentage reduction.
It is significant compared to 11. I've just got some short questions, Convener, if I may. I was a lecturer before I came here in further and higher education, and I still see many colleagues in the Highlands. They're asking me about national pay bargaining, which I understand is due to come in this year. Now, can I just ask a question on national pay bargaining? Because the Highlands and Islands colleges within the UHI, as Tavish Scott will know, they tend to languish fairly near the bottom, whereas Reid Care is at the top. Now, what they're asking me is, will we all be levelled up to the level of Reid Care, meaning that Reid Care lecturers, staff would have to go without pay rises for some time? Can you just tell me how this national pay bargaining will work? Will it be equal pay for equal work as a lecturer or IT expert or wherever throughout Scotland?
I don't think we can help you with that, I'm afraid, Ms Scanlon. The focus of this has very much been on the annual accounts of the colleges as they currently stand and progress towards the reform and regionalisation agenda. I think that's the committee you'd need to direct towards either the Funding Council or the Association of Scotland's Colleges.
You understand that lecturers in, say, UHI are paid £5,000 less than Reid Care. Many people are very concerned. I'm not a trade unionist, maybe my convener can help me, but what is your understanding of national pay bargaining?
To be fair,
that...
I don't think that's one for Audit Scotland, and there are clearly financial implications of implementing national pay bargaining. So I think we would maybe need to ask, I don't know whether the Scottish Government would have a role in this, or whether it would be the Funding Council, but if we could maybe find out who exactly it would be, and what the financial implications and the consequences would be for each individual college. But to be fair, I don't think it's one for Audit Scotland.
You understand, people are concerned about that. It feels like yesterday that we looked at the last Audit Scotland report, and I noticed it's October last year, but there were some points that I highlighted, and it's points that, if I've read every word in this week's one, perhaps I haven't, that I didn't notice. But one from last year that I did raise as a concern, and it's not here, and I hope this is appropriate, that the pension deficit in the college sector has increased sixfold since 2007. It was 10.8 million in 2007, and last year it stood at 60 million. I would have thought that that was appropriate as we move forward towards merging colleges. Am I right in saying it's not mentioned, and would I be right in saying it's still a concern, or perhaps it's been addressed?
It is still a concern, and we have addressed it in the report here. It's a long and complex report, so don't worry that you've missed it. Paragraphs 19 onwards talk about the pension deficits, and what we show broadly is that the deficit on the pension reserves almost doubled to 115 million between 2010-11 and 2011-12.
Oh gosh, it's even worse than I was anticipating.
And we can talk you through what's behind that. Two of the things that are affecting the change in the valuation there are effectively accounting adjustments, prudent adjustments, and adjustments that reflect the state of the financial world at the moment. We're seeing both the reduction in the assumed rate of return on the funds that are invested, which is no surprise to see. And secondly, a reduction in the discount rate, which has the effect of increasing their valuation. The third factor is that we've seen more FE staff taking early retirement, and that's a real increase in the deficit on the pension reserve there. So three things going on which all have the impact of increasing the deficit. But again, we would make the same point I think we did last year, that these are very long-term liabilities that certainly need to be managed, but won't have an immediate impact on any individual college or the sector as a whole.
Okay, sorry, I missed that one. And just my final...
Sorry, just before you move on from pensions, can you clarify something? You say in paragraph 19 that teaching staff are usually members of the Scottish Teachers Superannuation Scheme. Some others will be in the local government pension scheme. Now, those are both national schemes. How does each college then have either a surplus or a deficit in its pension if members are participating in a national scheme? Is the national scheme then divided up between colleges?
effectively they're divided into separate plots for each of the main employers, separate pots for each of the main employers who are part of the scheme. But I'll ask Graham to talk you through the way that works in more detail.
Okay. As you say, there are two main pension schemes that college employees are members of. The Scottish Teachers Superannuation Scheme is an unfunded scheme, so basically colleges are making contributions to that scheme to cover the future cost of their pensioners. In respect of the local government pension scheme, there's actually several local government pension schemes across the country, and the local college tends to belong to the local government pension scheme in respect of its non-teaching staff. Under accounting rules, the local government pension scheme is a funded scheme, i.e. the money that it collects is invested in stocks and shares and so forth. And under the accounting rules, colleges account for their share of that pension scheme in their own accounts, in exactly the same way that, for example, the local authority will also account for their pension costs in the same way. So that the college's accounts will show both their share of the assets of that overall pension scheme plus their liabilities of that overall pension scheme.
But in neither scheme, there couldn't be the possibility in either scheme that that particular college pension fund would go bust, or there would be a problem, because they're all part of a bigger scheme, even though they're merely accounting for it. So although, for example, you say that it's 9.6 million for James Watt College, in terms of the pension fund, that's neither here nor there. The impact is then on the college accounts.
If the pension scheme went bust, as you put it, it's not just the college who would lose its share of the assets and liabilities, it's every other member of that pension scheme.
But equally, in terms of meeting future liabilities, there's no greater financial burden on James Watt College because of the health of the pension scheme. Everybody would share in the contribution, presumably, to the share of the pension scheme.
That's right. And that's the kind of thing that actuaries look at routinely, and depending on how that pension scheme is performing, they might require members of that pension scheme to increase their contributions to the scheme to address any liabilities which are there.
Yeah, do you have another one before I bring
No, it was
Bob
just a very brief one. And again, it was from last year, and I raised it last year, and it was about the first set of outcomes last year was about the amount of learning and structural change. You did write last year there should be greater focus on colleges' contribution to the development of a highly educated and skilled workforce. So I was kind of slightly disappointed when I saw out of the 5 outcomes on 54, there was half an outcome: improve the quality of education so that 1,000 more full-time students successfully complete their courses. I wouldn't see 1,000 finishing courses as an indication that the quality of education had increased across the board. And I just wonder, is there sufficient emphasis on the quality as well as the finances here?
I'll ask Ronnie to talk you through what we know about the development of outcome agreements.
Yes, thank you. I think we recognise that the development of outcome agreements is a bit of a journey for all the public bodies that are involved in that across the public sector. Last year, we looked at the initial ones. We felt they were fairly basic, but they were focused on planning and structural reform aspects. We see some movement this year, and that's particularly supported by some work that was done by Education Scotland as well for the Scottish Funding Council. And we see more focus on what we might call outputs rather than outcomes. But we see that as being at least some progress towards where we would want to be, and seeing those agreements managing longer term benefits as a result of the education process in colleges.
To understand that anyone reading that, there's not a lot of focus on the quality, but more on the finances.
I think that's why we've recommended that attention needs to continue to develop the outcome agreements.
Thank you.
Okay, Bob.
Thanks, Convener. I'm just on outcome agreements. I was looking at that part, Ms Scanlon, whilst you were talking about quality. And one of the targets within the outcome agreement is improve the quality of education so that 1,000 more full-time students successfully complete their courses. So quality is actually part inherent within the outcome agreements. And that's just, I happened to be looking at that page as you were making that comment about quality, but it was in relation to outcome agreements, community planning that I had an interest in, but actually also, if I can go to page 34 within the report in section 74, where you mention the application process of colleges, and the recommendation, page 35, it says that colleges should implement the Scottish Government's recommendations to improve the application process to help monitor the demand for college places. Some more information on that would be welcome, but can I give you the context? I'm keen to know that. I know that if a student decides they wish to do a course in construction, be it bricklaying, joinery or whatever, and applies for a course at North Glasgow College, at City of Glasgow College and another college, that may show up on figures as a demand for 3 college places, but what you really have is one student exercising a range of choices. And I'm just wondering how that's audited within the system, because that may give it may capture the range of desires that students have, but it doesn't actually reflect the demand there is on college places. And as we go forward trying to identify the amount of college places that are needed within the system, would it not be better to have a more sophisticated system to actually track the demand from the student sector? So I'm hoping that that's partly what this recommendation's got to do with, because sometimes politicians of all parties talk about demand and unmet demand within the sector, but actually we're not necessarily reflecting the amount of college students that are seeking courses. They're merely applying for several courses, so some more information on that would be welcome.
It's an issue that's had a lot of attention over the last year, and I think the government has recognised that we do need that better information about the real level of need and demand rather than the level of applications, which may not necessarily reflect either. I think in terms of progress that's been made, that's a question for the Funding Council and the government, but I'll ask Phil to update you on what we know about progress to date.
The paragraph 74 came on the back of 2 separate surveys which produced widely different results in terms of demand for college courses, and the government, in its report published in March this year, made a number of recommendations to work with the likes of the Funding Council, colleges and Colleges Scotland to, as you say, monitor and manage the demand for places so that we don't have situations where you do have multiple applications from a single student, which are then counted and double counted, and they give a false impression of unmet demand. So that's why we had the recommendation in here for colleges to work with the government and the Funding Council to have a more robust measure of demand for college places.
I wonder, I can see the importance of that. I'm just wondering, I want to look forward, just retrospectively, would governments have, and the Funding Council have based developing the range of college courses, be it part-time or full-time courses, on false assumptions previously based on the amount of applications rather than the amount of actual students seeking college places? So was there poor practice previously, and would you say this is a necessary step to take to better plan the college sector?
We would certainly say this is a necessary step to take, particularly given the importance that FE has in the government's whole employability agenda, which is central in the current economic climate, and the regionalisation and reform agenda, which means that we should be planning on a much more regional basis. I can't go as far as to say that planning in the past was based on poor information. The applications were part of the information that was used by individual colleges and by the Funding Council, but they were only part of it. And we know from the 2 studies that Phil referred to that there were different sets of assumptions working in there. It's not the subject of this audit, but it may well be an issue that you'd like to explore further with the Funding Council and the government in taking these issues further.
That's helpful. Final question, Convener, is I did start off by talking about community planning and agreed outcomes. I'm just wondering how the recommendation on page 35 that I was referring to in terms of properly gauging the demand for a college or for a region, how that feeds into or links with community planning. Is there a link between that, or is there work in progress to make sure that there is an alignment between college provision within a region and community plans within a region?
I think that's very much still work in progress. Back in May of this year, I published a report jointly with the Accounts Commission on progress with community planning. And one of the findings in there was that FE reform and some other parts of the public service reform agenda don't always look closely aligned with community planning. What we're expecting to see now with the refreshed approach to community planning and the single outcome agreements is a much clearer line of sight from the priorities for an area right through to the targets and outcomes agreed for an individual college or college region, so that we can see how the actions taken within the FE sector are contributing both to the local community planning priorities and the national priorities that the government set. But it is work in progress still.
So if I'm lucky enough to be still on the Public Audit Committee in, say, 3 years' time, Ms Gardner, he says with some irony, should I expect to see a much closer correlation between community planning and how colleges design and promote courses for students within their area?
The short answer is yes, and we'll be able to give you evidence about that from two ends of the telescope, if you like. One is the reports on community planning that we'll continue to produce, and the other is reports on further education and employability, and we should start to see those joining up much more clearly than we can at the moment.
Thanks very much.
Okay, I think Colin Beattie, will you want to come in?
Yeah, thank you, Convener. I'm looking at page 9, the key messages, and particularly paragraph 2, which says there's often no discernible pattern in colleges' ability to achieve a surplus. I'm having a bit of trouble with that one, because a college will have a business plan, it'll have a budget. To a large extent, its cash flows in and out will be predictable. And yet it seems almost as if whether it has a surplus or a deficit is almost random. Could you?
Of course. I think what it reflects is the other comment we make in here about the very tight margins to which most colleges are operating. And what that means is that although they do have plans and financial controls and all of the things that you've referred to, they're also quite vulnerable to short-term changes. Whether they could be foreseen or not is always a difficult question to answer, but it does mean that an upturn or a downturn in student numbers, in funding, in an unexpected charge coming through can have quite a marked impact on their ability to make a surplus or deficit.
So we're talking, very small changes causing that?
Exactly. I think it reflects the fact that most of the surpluses or deficits were in 3%, Phil, is that correct? So it doesn't take very much of a shift in either income or expenditure to switch from a surplus to a deficit.
Turning to page 13, looking at paragraphs 17 and 25, given the comments there, just for my own satisfaction, can you confirm that, in your opinion, there is not at the moment any concerns about the financial position of the individual colleges that are listed?
The auditors who audit each of the colleges are required to give an assurance about going concern, and in each case they've given that assurance as part of their audit for the 2011-12 financial year. At the same time, we say in the report that there are some significant challenges for the sector as a whole, and that they need to be carefully managed. So in strict accounting terms, no concerns about going concern, but as the report says, some challenges that will need careful management by the colleges, by the Funding Council and by government.
I'd like to just briefly return to the pension deficit of 115.3 million, which seems an awful lot of money. In your paragraphs 20 and 21, you seem to be indicating that the deficit is sustainable in the short term. When does it really become a problem? When does it become the point at which the colleges get a gun put to their head and told to put money in?
I don't think there's a particular date at which that will happen. I think the benefit of valuing pension assets and liabilities in a transparent way, as the financial reporting standards now require, means that the scale of the problem that needs to be managed over a long period becomes more apparent. Two things to say. First of all, it obviously is very sensitive to small changes in the assumptions for the discount rate and the rate of return on investments where that's applicable. And secondly, there's a range of responses that can be made. We highlight in paragraph 21 some of the changes which the UK government is proposing to pension schemes to bring the assets and liabilities back into balance. And there is also, as Graham's alluded to, a process by which the actuaries for each of the schemes will make recommendations to the scheme as a whole and to individual scheme members, individual colleges, about the contributions that they should make. So I think what we're keen to see is is this committee, the government, the Funding Council and colleges keeping an eye on those liabilities and making sure that over time they're moving in the right direction.
Okay, moving to page
Sorry,
17.
can I just clarify, coming back to this issue of pensions again, that if colleges are asked to pay for whatever reason in the future extra into the pension funds, that would be at the same time that all the local authorities would also be having to make additional contributions, presumably, for the members who would make up the vast bulk of contributors.
I'm going to ask Graham to keep me straight here because pension accounting is very complex and I'm not an expert in it. I think it operates at two levels. I think for the scheme as a whole, there is a triennial review about the level of contributions made by members rather than by the public bodies to make sure that they're keeping pace. And for individual colleges and other members of the local government pension schemes, there can be a requirement to make additional payments to reduce the scale of their deficit over time.
A differential payment for each individual body?
That's certainly the case for some members of the local
Right.
government pension scheme. It's the case for Audit Scotland, for example, in relation to our own staff who are members of it. Graham, do you want to add to that?
I think Caroline's analysis is spot on. That's one of the reasons why the colleges, the pension scheme administrators try to identify each member's share of the assets and liabilities of the pension scheme so that any difference in liabilities can be addressed through changes to the contribution rates.
That takes me back to a question I asked earlier. So, you know, in relation to James Watt was mentioned, which is now part of West College, but just for argument's sake, James Watt, if there was a concern about the pension pot at James Watt or indeed West Lothian or any of the colleges, they could be asked to pay over and above what other contributors are having to pay if there was a worry about their specific pension pot.
I'll caveat this that we will need to confirm it with you afterwards, convener, but our understanding is that in relation to the historic deficit for an individual member, for the liabilities that are already built up as opposed to those that are forecast to build up in future, the local government pension scheme allows for a specific additional payment to reduce the deficit from the contributing body, the college, or in future the new merged college that you refer to. We don't know whether that's the case for any of the colleges across Scotland or the one that you refer to, but it is a possibility and happens in relation to current members of the local government scheme.
Does that mean, and there have been some concerns expressed about college management over the years, that there were generous remuneration packages offered with significant pension pots on offer, and then again enhanced payments made for early retirement, that all of those would have a specific burden on an individual college, that college or its successors could potentially have to pay. So in other words, the managers who were party to encouraging those responsible in their colleges to look at enhanced pension provision for the senior staff could well benefit from it, but then leave with a package and not have to worry about who was going to pay for that in the future.
I can't comment on the specifics that you're referring to there, but it's obviously the fact that for any member of one of the public sector pension schemes, past decisions about retirements and early retirements will have an impact on future liabilities. And our understanding is that that can affect both the overall levels of scheme contributions and the levels for individual members. That's one of the reasons for the Accounts Commission's reports on managing the local government pension scheme in particular, to make sure that early retirement decisions are made in full knowledge of the likely impact of those costs.
It's just that I remember hearing complaints about what was going on at James Watt prior to the merger, where the salaries and pension packages of senior staff were enhanced considerably. And indeed, just before the merger, I think the principal of James Watt was on what was termed gardening leave for between 6 months and a year before leaving with a very generous package. Now, that would then mean that the successors will have to bear the burden of that generous provision made by those in James Watt at the time. Would that be the case?
Again, I can't comment on the specifics. It's not what we've audited here. I can reiterate the point that past decisions made about early retirement will have an impact on the future costs of the pension schemes and the future liabilities.
Something that we could inquire about. Sorry, Colin.
Turn to page 17, Exhibit 7. I notice that between 2010-11 and 2011-12, administration costs have actually increased. Does that figure include perhaps an element of the cost of the merger, or is it that the administration costs have in fact gone up, which wouldn't be the right way?
I'll ask Phil to talk you through what more we know about these figures, which are taken from the annual accounts.
We don't have the details of what the administration costs actually involved, but a large part of the merger costs were spent on staff severance packages, and that's one of the ways in which colleges are achieving their savings from one year to the next. In fact, that is the main reason.
So we don't actually know what's contained within that.
No, we haven't
figure.
drilled down to that level of detail from the accounts.
Okay, it just stands out. Just one last question.
Sorry, as does the other figure, which is other including exceptional costs.
The exceptional costs could include the staff severance packages, but unlikely the administration costs include that.
Unfortunately, it seems to be speculation as to what it's comprised.
Is there a way of finding out?
It's not speculation, Convener. It is, as the report tries to make clear, that this is pulling together the accounts of all of the colleges across Scotland as an exercise in demonstrating what's changing. It is possible for us to explore this further for next year's report if you have an interest in it, and if the committee wishes to do it, to explore it further with the Funding Council about what they know about the costs of mergers and how they're being funded.
Is there a way then to find out for that period between 10-11 and 11-12 how much colleges cumulatively were paying on packages?
Ask Graham to pick that one up.
I think if the committee is interested in pursuing this, we could probably do a little more analysis and break down that Exhibit 7 into a little bit more detail and explore some of the issues which have been raised here.
And just one last question. Given the change in college status, which is coming up, how will that affect their present borrowing powers?
Graham is keeping a close eye on this for us, so it's back to Graham again.
The reclassification project, the consequences of college reclassification largely fall into two camps. One side of it is the consequences as a result of the change in the college's accounting year. That's largely procedural and manageable. Perhaps more challenging is the consequences of colleges now becoming part of the Scottish Government's overall budgetary control regime. Under the current system, what counts as college expenditure is basically what the Funding Council gives colleges in the way of grant. In the future, from April 2014, what counts as Scottish Government, what counts as expenditure within the Scottish Government's budgetary control regime is all college expenditure, regardless of how it's funded. So, cutting to the chase, what that means is that obviously the Scottish Government has an annual budget limit. That limit also will apply to colleges, so that in the future, if colleges incur a deficit, they will require annual budget cover. Basically, that means that the Scottish Government will have to find savings from elsewhere within its budget to support colleges. If colleges make a surplus in any one year, with the intention of using it in future years, then the surplus will count as an underspend in the year in which it is incurred, but the future spend will require budget cover. If colleges wish to use their current level of cashback reserves to support their activities in the future, that would require budget cover. And equally, if they borrow to support capital investment, for example, then that expenditure will also require budget cover. So these are quite significant changes. The sector, that's the colleges themselves, the Funding Council and the government, are currently looking at ways at how best to mitigate against the effects of the ONS's decision, and to ensure that colleges still have that flexibility to manage their reserves and their annual surpluses going forward. At the moment, they're considering various options to how best to do that. It's still very much early days. No college has come out with any firm proposals of how they intend to do that, but I think it is the sort of thing that we will be keeping an eye on as the months progress, and it's the sort of thing that I think we would be expected to see more about in subsequent college reports that we produce.
I think your answer alarms me more than the original question, Dave. Colleges obviously have facilities at the moment which enable them to manage their cash flow. Will they be able to continue with that? Because it'll be quite awkward if they can't.
They will still be able to manage their cash flow, yes. I think the main challenge for the colleges is how they retain access to their current level of reserves, and how they are able to utilise any surpluses that they make from year to year.
Okay, thank you. Ken McIntosh and then Tavish Scott.
Thanks, Davina. One of the figures that jumps out, Auditor General, is that in the year that you're looking at, 2011-12, 48,000 fewer Scots went to college, and I think over the 3 years up to then, about 100,000 fewer Scots went to college. Is that correct?
The figure for the current year is certainly in this report. I'm not sure if we have the 3-year figure to hand.
It's on
Can you
pages
give me a
18
page
and
reference,
19.
Mr. McIntosh? Sorry, page.
Sorry, pages 18 and 19. I think it's paragraph 32 suggests it's 48,000 fewer Scots going to college in 1 year, and then the chart makes it look as though it's 100,000 roughly. Anyway.
We would have to confirm the 3-year figure. I think it's important to say, as we say in the report, that that change reflects a specific government policy choice to focus on 16 to 19-year-old students and on full-time courses rather than shorter or part-time courses. That is linked to the government's policy objectives for employability, and it clearly has consequences for other groups. As I said in my introduction, we think it's important the impact on those other groups is monitored and action is taken where necessary.
Yeah, but the figures I'm quoting, well, you're quoting, they're quite dramatic figures, are they not? Number of people going to college.
As I say, I think the way in which the government's policy choices play out have a natural consequence of more younger students and more full-time students, but fewer older students and fewer part-time students. When you convert that into a head count, it does reflect a reduction in the number of people at college, but really within that a retargeting on younger and full-time students compared to other groups.
There was a cut of £56 million in that 1 year, which led to the drop of 48,000 students going to college, and you're suggesting that there's going to be cuts, well that was 9%, there are going to be cuts from 11% to come. So are you suggesting that there will be a further fall in the number of Scots going to college because of that?
I think that's a question you would need to take up with the Government and the Funding Council. What we've set out in here is the figures that we have from the Scottish draft budget for the 2 years ahead in terms of further education funding. We know that what government's current policy is in terms of the focus on 16 to 19-year-olds and full-time courses. It's not possible for us to draw a clear line of sight between the two, but it's something you may want to explore with either the Government or the Funding Council.
And in terms of staff, I think there's just over 1,000 staff that have lost their jobs because of full-time equivalent, in fact, probably more than 1,000 people, but
1,200, I think, is the figure
1,200
we
full-time equivalent have lost their jobs. So again, and you point out that the majority of the cuts have been dealt with by the colleges by getting rid of staff, and you're predicting, or you're suggesting there's another 11% of cuts to follow. So can you see any way of more lecturers not being laid off?
The way in which individual colleges respond to the reduction in funding that's available for further education is a matter for them in discussion with the Funding Council. And obviously the other bit of the jigsaw is the outcome agreements that they have and the targets to which they sign up for, in the jargon, weighted student units of measurement. Horrible phrase, but it aims to standardise different types of students doing different types of courses. I think that is an area that the committee would need to explore with the Funding Council and the government if they want to know more about it. It's clear that this government is operating within a UK-wide climate of financial austerity that requires choices to be made in the budget which are outside my remit. The focus of this report is very much on making transparent for this sector, as we do for the health service and other sectors, what the figures look like as a basis for holding the government to account.
No, indeed, just bear with me here. I'm just trying to work out if there's been a 9% cut and we've lost 48,000 students and 1,200 staff, and we're going to get an 11% cut. How can they do it? How can colleges do that without either cutting staff or the number of students or both? Do they have anything else at their disposal they can do?
Two things to say, I think, without answering the question about how they will and should do it. First of all, we know that staffing accounts for about 60% of their costs, so it's clear that that's an area they will have to look at as part of managing the reduction they're facing. The second is that the government and the Funding Council see the reform agenda as being a way not just of increasing the quality of education, but also of generating efficiencies that can help to balance the funding available with the objectives for education. There's obviously a whole range of things within that mix which are unknown at the moment, but you may want to explore with the government and the Funding Council what their plans are for how that circle will be squared.
I'm trying to think, what could it be? More students in the classroom or less hours per student? What? I
think that really is a question you'd have to explore with the Funding Council, but there's a whole range of questions around what efficiencies could be generated from the reform agenda that will be different in different parts of the country in different circumstances.
You've given us very good analysis of the figures themselves. Do you make any analysis of the impact they have? In other words, the actual impact on quality of education. It looks like the staff have borne the brunt of these cuts so far. If they're 60% of the running costs, they've borne the brunt of the cuts. Clearly, you're saying they're efficiently run as institutions on a financial basis. Do you make any impact on the capacity of colleges to absorb this level of cut without it affecting the quality of education or the number of students taught? So.
Two things to say, I think. First of all, we're clear in this report that it's a work in progress. It's a review of how the reform agenda is being taken forward and the impact that's having on expenditure, on student numbers and some other indicators that we have in here. We will keep that under review over time, and it may be appropriate in due course to do a full assessment of the reform and how it's worked out. I'm not making a commitment to that, but it's certainly something we'll keep under review as part of our updating of our work programme. But it's also the case that the Funding Council and the government are and should be monitoring the impact of the reform agenda against the plans that they made, and it's something you may want to explore with them while it is still a work in progress to get more information from them about the impact they expect it to have and how they're monitoring the effects on quality as well as on costs.
Are you aware are you aware of any measurement that they do use? Are you aware of any forecast they are using in terms of student numbers or staff numbers?
That's very much a question you'd have to ask of the Funding Council and the government.
Can I just ask another area, which is the issue, is come back to the issue of reserves, which a couple of colleagues have touched upon. I'm right, well, you're saying at page 12 that the colleges currently have about 214 million in reserves. First of all, just to clarify, it looks like a couple of the colleges that have had trouble, Forth Valley, for example, have increased the deficit on their reserve has increased substantially. And I noticed at paragraph 13, you say that the staff severance costs associated with planned restructuring amounted to £1.1 million. It strikes me that basically the restructuring, the regionalisation programme, has been paid for out of reserves here. Is that right?
For some colleges it certainly is the case and was the plan that some colleges would contribute towards the costs of restructuring from their reserves. Others are receiving direct support from the Funding Council. We provide a bit more information in paragraph 17 about the 3 colleges with deficits on their I&E reserves.
I again, you might not know this, but I thought that the Griggs report specifically said that the colleges shouldn't use the reserves for restructuring. It was a recommendation.
I'm not aware of that recommendation, but we do talk within the report about the difference between different colleges and different college regions in the extent to which they are expected to contribute themselves towards the cost of reforms, and that reflects both local circumstances and the level of reserves available to them.
Next year, when from April, when they become public bodies again under the ONS recommendations, am I right in thinking the government can therefore access the college reserves? I say this because last year, after the police forces were restructured, the government basically took what was in the police reserves and used it as government money. I take it the government can and probably will do that again. Are you expecting them to do so?
Graham's outlined some of the potential impacts of the reclassification of colleges as public bodies on their finances. And one of them is that surpluses generated by colleges count against the overall government spending limits. Now, there is also a lot of work going on at the moment to manage the impacts of that, looking at the different options that are available to them. And we can't second guess what the outcome of that work will be.
Would you expect the government to take this money, 214 million, so they can get their hands on them?
I'm not sure I'd frame the question in that way. This is public money in any case, and there are clearly important questions to be important decisions to be made about the way it should be used in relation to the FE sector, to individual colleges, and wider priorities. Those decisions are well outside my remit. What we've highlighted here is the potential impact that the changing classification could have on the overall financial framework for colleges.
Just thinking in terms of good financial planning, we had a debate recently about trying to move to 3-year funding generally for, this is actually for the voluntary sector. Here we have colleges moving away from advanced planning, moving to annual budgets. Do you think that if the government takes away their 200 million reserves, that's going to help their ability to plan for the future? Or
again, I come at it slightly differently. My report on NHS finances last year made a very specific point about the effect that the annual targets for individual health boards make it harder for them to take a longer-term approach to financial planning. Now, that's an issue which affects not only health boards, but all of the bodies which are part of that public sector financial framework. There are good reasons for it, but my recommendation was that government should be looking at ways of encouraging and supporting longer-term financial planning, and I think the same issue potentially applies to FE colleges on the back of the ONS reclassification.
I've got two very brief points.
Well, we need to be very brief because we're starting to run out of time.
Just first of all, on the staff severance payments, I noticed that there have been compulsory redundancies every year, actually, continuing use of compulsory redundancies in the college sector, despite supposedly government policy against this. There's also been increasing use of compromise agreements. And just to give you the figures, this is from my own FOI rather than from your report, which, and if I may say so, your report got higher figures than I got from my FOIs on compromise agreements. They've gone up from, there were 9 in 708 to 24 the next year, to 73, to 117, to 146, to 411 last year, at a cost over $1 million. That strikes me as a very worrying trend. Is that something that you've picked up and you would caution against, or would expect the colleges to be aware of?
In paragraph 30 of the report on page 17, we talk about the amount spent on staff severance payments during 2011-12 as we've taken it from the accounts, and that was £21 million. I don't recognise the figures you've got, and I'm not surprised by that given their different sources and potentially the different way that colleges are managing the reduction in staff and the broader reform agenda. I think it's important to say that if the reform agenda is going to generate efficiencies in the way that it's proposed, it's likely there will be some either reductions in staff numbers or changes in the balance of staffing to make sure that future needs can be met. What's important to me is that those changes are transparent to the Parliament and to others with an interest. This report's a contribution to that, but as we say in it very clearly, it's not the whole story because it's still a work in progress. We are keeping a close eye on it, and I will consider in future whether there would be value in bringing a further report back to the committee. But for now, what we have is the information from the college's accounts for 2011-12, and I think the broader question of the way in which colleges are managing the balance between efficiency and quality is one to explore with the Funding Council and the government.
Just very specifically on compromise agreements, just because not only, I mean, you produced a report on which highlighted the use and warned against the misuse of compromise agreements. They are clearly on the increase. These are FOIs that I did in all the colleges. I mean, quite dramatic increase from 9 to 24 to 70, 117, 146, 411. That's not just a dramatic, but a worrying trend going in the wrong direction. Would you, does that flag up any warnings to you at all?
We were very clear in the report on reducing the size of the workforce, on early departures from the public sector, that there can be a role for compromise agreements. They can be used to protect both parties to an agreement from future legal action, for example. We're also very clear that they shouldn't be used to gag whistleblowers or to hide concerns about the way public bodies have managed particular situations. So the trend in itself doesn't concern me, but the way in which they're used is obviously very important and is a matter of public interest, and it is something you may wish to explore with the Funding Council.
And last question is just an individual wrote to me, a constituent, concerned about the particular cost of Glasgow City College's capital programme and suggesting that it will have an impact on the capacity of the overall college sector in Glasgow. Is this something that you've been able to, or is this within your remit to look at a question like that, and have you done so?
I've also had a query about that particular investment project as part of our general responsibility to understand the way public money is being spent and to be aware of issues that may be of concern. The auditor is looking at that for me at the moment, but I don't have any further findings to report back at this stage, I'm afraid.
Very much.
Scott.
Thank you very much. My apologies for being late, Convener. And if Caroline Gardner covered this in her opening remarks, refer me to the remarks she made some moments ago. I wanted to try and understand the landscape now that is financial governance in the college sector. And so if I get this right, tell me. We have the Scottish Funding Council, then we have regional boards, then we have college boards. What is the relationship between those three bodies and who drives the process?
I'm going to ask Ronnie to pick that question up. This is still very much work in progress, but I think we can give you an outline picture of it.
Yes, the Scottish Government expects the Scottish Funding Council to manage overall the money that's given to individual colleges, and those are now being directed through the regions. It is work in progress, and the links between the funding given and what is delivered from the college sector has been managed by outcome agreements. Those are in their early stages, as we said earlier on. We see these needing to develop and needing to improve, and that would be the basic outline.
So who sets the outcome agreement?
Well, the Scottish Funding Council requires college regions to produce the outcome agreements for their areas now, and those are they have to respond to specific things that the Scottish Funding Council asks them to contain. So
where does an individual college fit into that, or not at all?
No, they would be represented on the regional board.
By whom?
Do you know, Phil? Sorry.
The arrangements for establishing the regional boards are in progress just now, and there's been correspondence from the Scottish Government to the regional boards to outline some transitional arrangements before things are finally in place next spring, I think.
Spring 2014, yes. This is all meant to be in place?
Yes, they're aiming to have the regional chairs and the regional boards in place by May next year.
So does that mean regional boards will then divvy up the money that is allocated to a region for the purposes of providing college places across that region? Sorry, divvy up is not a very good accounting phrase, I appreciate.
Divvy up isn't the phrase we would use, but I think the aim is that the regional board would pull together each of the colleges in the region, agree a picture of what the needs and demand are in that area, and then how they would plan between them to meet that need or demand with the funding that's available from the Funding Council.
And how are you going to audit that? Will you therefore just be will Audit Scotland therefore in future be auditing the, sorry, this is all about the future, but will you be auditing in that sense the regional boards rather than individual colleges?
We will be auditing the groupings which make up the accounting entities, if I can put it that way. In most cases, that will be the new colleges, the merged colleges that work through. And the regional boards are a planning and resource allocation mechanism between those colleges and the funding council.
So in the past, or what Audit Scotland previously audited is the relationship between the Scottish Funding Council and colleges. Now there is another structure in the middle of this, which will effectively be where all the decisions are taken once they have received their allocation from the Funding Council. Would that be fair?
The regional boards will have a role in agreeing between the colleges and the funding council the resource allocation. What we do is track the money, so we can audit the system as a whole, we can audit the funding council and in most cases the new merged colleges that are spending it. But because I have got the Section 23 powers that let me carry out reports like this, we still have oversight of the whole system if we think there is an issue there that's worth investigating.
So if an individual college, wherever it might be in Scotland, ultimately feels it didn't win in the, or simply was unsuccessful in its application for funds to the regional board, you'd still be able to look into that in terms of assessing why a particular college failed on student numbers or failed on government targets, which of course are set at the centre, and so on and so forth.
Yes, I'd say one of the benefits of the public audit model in Scotland is that it is joined up and we can look at it at whatever level of aggregation is most useful.
Right, okay, that's very helpful. Two very brief questions, if I may. Firstly, on paragraph 43, on Ken McIntosh's point about the Griggs review, you did cover that in, Audit Scotland do cover that in 43, if I read it correctly. What I wanted to ask about paragraph 43 is that Audit Scotland point out that where individual colleges had the money, presumably in reserves, the government expected colleges to use those reserves to meet a proportion, in your terminology, a significant proportion of their merger costs. What happened when they didn't have the money?
Some funding is available directly from the Scottish Government through the Funding Council to fund mergers, and the question is a bigger one than just whether they've got the money. It's what the overall state of development of FE looks like in a region, what funding's available, to what extent that's earmarked for capital investment, and therefore what needs to be met from Scottish Government on that basis.
I'm not really understanding that. I thought this paragraph was specifically about meeting the cost of all these mergers that have taken place across Scotland. And I didn't realise it was about all these other wider factors as well.
I think paragraph 44 is the one that aims to explain what's happening. For each of the mergers, there is a plan that sets out what the likely costs are, and there's then an agreement between the Funding Council and the colleges involved about how those costs will be met, reflecting the amounts available in reserves, but also the extent to which those reserves are already intended to be used for capital investment.
Okay, but if a college in a region didn't have any reserves, then ultimately the merger, the pooling together of those colleges was funded by the government in effect.
Yes.
Is that so? Okay, thank you. And on the other question I just wanted to ask was on 47, which talks about the City of Glasgow College, and Audit Scotland mentioned that the merger cost. Let me get the right sentence. In May 2013, the Funding Council reported that the merger had delivered savings of about 5 million so far, and that the college had estimated total savings of over 26 million between 2010 and 2015. I think that's the full sentence. Is 5 million as a work in progress, and do you expect the 26 million target to be met?
You'll notice that the wording there is careful. What we've reported is what the Scottish Funding Council has reported and what it expects. We haven't, as I've said, evaluated the costs and benefits of reform yet. It's something we may do in future, and it's something which the committee may wish to explore with the Funding Council.
But the whole point, was it not, of this proposal, as you gave in evidence earlier on to the committee, is that this whole merger programme, the centralisation of colleges, is about saving money. Well, if it hasn't happened there, and your correct wording is about this is the funding colleges, observations on it, then something's not going very well, is it?
What I'm saying is that we haven't yet carried out that evaluation, and it's something you may want to explore with the Funding Council. We may well explore that in future, but that's not what this report aims to do.
Well, can I take it as one humble member? I think you should look into that.
Thank you, I hear.
Thank you.
Mary, you wanted to clarify something?
A very brief supplementary on the point that Mr Nicholl was making to Tavish Scott. My understanding is that in the Highlands and Islands the funding stream is different, and that funding for colleges actually goes through UHI, which my understanding is that it's filtered through UHI, and that filter costs 15 million. That wasn't mentioned. It's just that several colleges are concerned that they may get a different or a lower level of funding per student than elsewhere in Scotland. Is that a concern of yours?
I think it is the case that the arrangements are different in Highland because of the existence of UHI. I can't comment on either the cost of that arrangement or what the impact might be in future. Again, I think it's something you may wish to explore with the Funding Council, and that we would pick up in evaluating progress of the reform if we do that in future.
That's right, thank you.
Willie Coffey and then James Dornan.
Thanks very much, Convener. Could I firstly pick up on the issue that was being discussed a wee moment ago with the reserves? I had a look back at an Audit Scotland report from 2008, 5 years ago, and at that time the college reserves stood at £100 million. Now they're over £200 million. Just to make the comment, I think it's reasonable. I think the public would expect it to be reasonable that the colleges make some kind of contribution towards the regionalisation process, given the substantial cash reserves that they have. But my question in that regard was really about the move to public body status, and it's been mentioned a few times in the discussion so far. What's the likely outcome to that in terms of the college reserves and them being restricted in their ability to build up cash reserves? Where is that money likely to go? Will it go into further capital investment, or where will it go?
As Graham said, there's a number of options being examined between the government and the Funding Council and colleges for how the issue of reclassification might be resolved. And all of those options have got pros and cons. I think our interest is in making sure, first of all, that they're transparent, that it's clear what's happened to that significant amount of public money that's built up over a period of time. That the mechanisms put in place enable colleges and the sector as a whole to plan for the longer term in terms of the investment that's needed, and in a wider sense that the way the money is treated enables the government as a whole and the further education sector to be making good decisions between competing choices, to prioritise rather than going for short-term decisions because that's expedient. Those are the criteria that we'll be applying in looking at the resolution that comes through, but it's too soon to talk about what actually the decision may be taken between the Funding Council and the government.
I mean looking back in the period that we've just come through, the 5 years, I mean, despite the commentary about funding cuts and so on, the actual cash reserves in the colleges have doubled in 5 years, which I think is a significant thing to say and has to be recognised, I think, at the committee. I wanted to ask you to clarify the comments that were made earlier by Mr Macintosh in relation to paragraph 32. Auditor General, it's about student numbers and so on and so forth, and the 48,000 figure was mentioned there. There's been a number of figures mentioned today, for example, 1,200 staff leaving the sector, but also in your report it says that we continue to maintain targets for learning activity, and that full-time equivalent students has remained broadly constant at 120 to 125,000. That tells me there's a shift in emphasis, obviously, from part-time to full-time. But it also tells me that those 48,000, they haven't disappeared. They've converted, a substantial proportion of them must have converted to full-time. Would that be the case?
We certainly don't know if that's the case, and the committee may want to explore with the Funding Council what they know about the individuals who make up the sheer headcount numbers that we've got here. But I'm very happy to restate that what we're saying about student numbers is a direct reflection of the government's quite proper policy choice. It's the government's role to do this, to focus on younger and full-time students because of the link to their employability and economic priorities. We can see that very clearly in Exhibit 9, which shows an increase in full-time students against a decrease in part-time students, and the following exhibit, Exhibit 10, does show, as you say, that the colleges have met their targets for learner activity, which is measured in weighted student units of measurement.
Just again, I mean, how can it be the case that if we lose 1,200 staff who leave the sector, that we can still maintain learning activity at the levels that they were at?
It's a question for the Funding Council and for individual colleges. Part of the answer, I suspect, is about the merger and reform agenda. Some of it will be about the regionalisation and the ability to plan across the region how best to meet the learning demand in that area. But that is a question for the sector rather than for us as auditors, I think.
Okay.
James Dunn.
Thank you, Convener. You mentioned in the report that the number of young people attending college has increased. And I'm just wondering, I've got two questions round about the Opportunities for All scheme. One is, do you plan to monitor what impact that has on the outcomes? I see that there's outcomes suggested in here, but specifically for the fact that there's going to be more 16 to 24-year-olds going in there, and where the end product would be. Would they be going to university? Would they be going into employment? Do you have any way of monitoring what the result is?
I think my answer to that question is very similar to an earlier question, that the first step is how the Funding Council and the government are monitoring the impact of their policy choices, as they should be doing, and that's one of our recommendations. If we do decide to do an evaluation of the reform programme as a whole, those are very much the sorts of questions we'd be looking to explore, along with the question of teaching quality that Ms Scanlon highlighted earlier.
Was there anything previously, or is there anything just now that lets us know where students go when they leave college?
Phil, can you help us with that?
In the new outcome agreements, the issue around the quality of education covers issues such as retention rates, qualifications achieved and destinations. So the new, what we say is improved outcome agreements, which are certainly improved since last year, have more of a focus on the delivery of education and where students go as a result of it. So there is more of that focus now, but we'd like to see them improve further and become more outcome focused, so that there's a greater link up with the wider education agenda and overall policy.
You also talk about a possible knock-on effect, being that over 25s and over will have less access to college. The government made an extra £61 million available, hoping that would help to mitigate that. Would you be able to monitor that extra money going into the system to see if that has a positive effect for those that we're talking about being affected?
Yes, if we carry out an evaluation of this whole reform programme, it's one of the probes we would use. And again, I would say our expectation is that the government and the Funding Council themselves should be monitoring it first. We should be reviewing what they're doing rather than doing it instead of them.
Thank you.
Mary, you had a question?
No, I've already asked it.
All right, okay.
I think about UHI,
Yeah, the one on the real time.
It was the one in the 15 million for UHI was the question.
Okay, that's fine. Listen, it's been a long session, and I think that indicates the interest which there is in Scotland's colleges. That's been very useful. I think, as well as giving us an explanation, you've highlighted a number of questions I think that we may wish to pursue with others. So I think it's maybe helped to shape our thinking of where we might want to go with that. So thank you very much for that. The next item on the agenda is another Section 23 report, this time on housing in Scotland. And I think is it Fraser McKinley who's going to offer us a briefing on that.
You and I might like a break after that session, so Fraser will take over.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Convener. And good morning, members. Housing is important for Scotland's people and communities. Well-planned, good quality housing contributes to strong, resilient communities and supports economic growth. It's a national asset and an area of significant public investment. The Scottish Government has an ambitious vision to provide an affordable home for all by 2020. The environment in which the housing sector is operating is not straightforward, and this is the first time we in Audit Scotland has looked in depth at the housing sector as a whole. In this audit, which is a joint report by the Auditor General and the Accounts Commission, we've considered how Scotland's housing sector works, how much money is spent, and what that money delivers. We've taken a wide look at the whole sector, and we will consider in future whether we should look in more depth at some of the issues raised by this work. And obviously, Convener will be very interested in the committee's views on that in due course. Turning to what we found, I think the first thing to say is that we're not suggesting, and nor is there, a single silver bullet that will solve the nation's housing needs in one go. The strength of the economy and wider financial pressures have a considerable impact on the housing sector. The recession and constraints on lending have meant that the number of new houses built by the private sector, the number of first-time buyers and the number of mortgages approved have all more than halved. At the same time, public sector budgets have reduced, with the Scottish Government's housing budget falling by around a third in real terms between 2008-09 and 2011-12. There are significant pressures on council and registered social landlord finances, particularly their capital budgets. Subsidies for RSLs have reduced at the same time as national targets on quality, energy efficiency and fuel poverty are placing increased demands on resources. It's worth pointing out, and I'm sure members will be aware, that since we published our report, the Scottish Government has increased its subsidy for new homes by £16,000 per unit, following an assessment of the financial capacity of councils and RSLs. Continuing the theme of funding for housing in Scotland, again, it's worth saying that there is no easy option at the moment for funding. The economic climate has meant that more innovative sources of funding have had to be sought. In response to the pressure on resources, the Scottish Government is encouraging councils and RSLs to use alternative models of finance to lever in private investment into housing. And those potential new sources of funding, such as bonds or pension funds, bring with them new risks and complexities that must be properly understood. To date, the use of these models have been limited, and the extent to which they can compensate for the reduced levels of subsidy is not yet clear. Many councils and RSLs lack experience and expertise in alternative financing models, and that's why we think the Scottish Government should clarify the role it expects these sources of financing to play in future, and to help councils and RSLs understand how best to take advantage of them and minimise the risks involved. We would also like to see greater clarity in terms of financial reporting. You'll see from the report that the funding for housing is an extremely complicated picture, a mixture of public and private finance, with one-off capital payments and ongoing revenue funding from a number of different sources. This can make funding streams hard to track and can cause difficulties for those planning and delivering housing. And just turning to close, convener, good housing can make a positive contribution to improving a wide range of outcomes for communities, including economic growth, community safety and improved health. However, it's our sense that housing's contribution to these wider aims could be improved. Local planning arrangements are complicated, and effective leadership is required at a national and local level to ensure that housing is making the biggest contribution it can to better outcomes. Convener, I'll pause there, and my colleagues and I, Claire and Sally, who were the team on this project, will be very happy to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. You say that the local planning situation is complicated. Reading this report, funding arrangements are hugely complicated. It's actually very difficult to get a clear idea of what's happening in order to make comparisons. But can I take you to page 16, Exhibit 6, and you talk about affordable homes and the target set in 2011. What is the definition of an affordable home?
I'll ask the team to come in, convener, in a second, but one of the points we make in the report is a need for greater clarity around some definitions in here, and affordable homes would be one of those. I think it also reflects a real change over the past decade and beyond in how we view housing and the state's role in housing, from quite a narrow definition around what social housing would be to a much wider interest in affordable homes and helping people get on the property ladder in the private sector. I'll maybe ask Claire or Sally if they have any further comment on the specifics of the affordable home definition.
Previously, as our report says, the terms affordable homes and social homes have been used sort of interchangeably. Social homes generally means traditional council and RSL homes for rent at significantly reduced rents. Affordable homes adds on to that the sort of idea of mid-market rents. So it's ideas where your home are still at a reduced rent, but you may or may not be able to buy it in the future.
So your understanding is that the definition of affordable homes is purely about homes for rent?
And to buy in the future. In terms of this target, that's what it means.
No, but not, leave the future aside, but if you're building an affordable home just now, your understanding is that affordable homes are only homes currently for rent?
We've got in, if you look at page 12, the final bullet at the top of the page on page 12, we make the point that home ownership is unaffordable for many people in Scotland, and a property is classed as affordable if it costs no more than 3.5 times a person's annual salary. But we estimate that the average property in Scotland costs 6 times the average salary. So we've highlighted in the report that there is an issue about affordability.
So an affordable home then would also include a house that's available to purchase?
In terms of the government's target,
yes.
Affordable homes means homes to rent in the long term and homes that you rent initially and then you can buy.
I'm not following this. I know that you can have homes which people have shared equity in and they can then purchase more equity in the future. But in terms of the definition, the government's definition of an affordable home, is it one which is currently rented even though that is available for purchase in the future, or does it include a home for purchase which is available at no more than 3.5 times the person's annual salary?
The government are measuring the target is all houses that are delivered through their affordable housing supply programme. So that includes all council and RSL homes, all sort of mid-market homes which you rent initially and you may be able to buy, plus all shared equity type homes.
Right, okay. But that doesn't include low-cost homes that are available for an outright purchase just now that's no more than 3.5 times the person's annual salary?
No, if it's not been delivered through one
So
of the
there's got to be
schemes.
a rental component.
As part of that.
Right, so there's got to be a rental component for it to be classified as an affordable home.
No, not necessarily, because the right to buy, the shared equity schemes.
The shared equity schemes would have a rental contribution as well as a purchase. If you buy 50%
Yeah.
Of the equity, you pay the capital sum for 50%, but you then pay a rent or an equivalent of a rent on the other 50%, presumably.
I think this conversation, convener, if I may say so, is exactly why we need a bit more clarity around the definitions. So I think, as it says in the note to Exhibit 6, which you've pointed out, we do recognise that the numbers are slightly different depending on where you're taking the figures from. As Sally says, for this particular target, the source comes through, the numbers are about home delivered through the Affordable Housing Supply Programme, and Sally's described those, which would be different from the new housing supply statistics. So I think we can certainly try and clarify it as best we can from our end, but I think this might be one of the things you might want to pick up with the Scottish Government when if you correspond with them subsequently.
How, in terms of you producing a report, how do you assess whether the Scottish Government has met its target when you actually can't define what the target is?
We can define the target as it's described in Exhibit 6, as Sally's just, I think, described.
Right, which takes me back to my question then.
Because we know what's in...
Does every affordable home then have to have a rental component?
I feel like we're getting hung up on the technicalities of what's a rental component and what's not. I think the definition that...
Well, no, because if we can't understand what the target is, then how can we have a sensible discussion? I understand any house which is purely for rent would be classified as an affordable home in the socially rented sector. I think you're suggesting that houses which have a shared equity element, where there might be a rental component as well as a capital component, is an affordable home. But houses which are available for outright purchase are not classified as an affordable home.
I think we need to come at it from the other end, convener. What we know is how the Scottish Government measures affordable homes. And as we say in the footnote to Exhibit 6, and as Sally has said, it's homes which are delivered through the Affordable Housing Supply Programme. That's how they have said they will measure it. And that, at the moment, includes the various types of home that Sally's outlined. There's no reason in future why the Affordable Housing Supply Programme couldn't include other types of housing tenure. But it's that clarity about the definition that we think would make it easier to understand how well the target sits against need and how well it's being delivered over time.
But you also say in that note that these numbers differ from those recorded in the Scottish Government's new housing supply statistics. It's clear as mud.
Yeah. And as Fraser has said, that's why we think there is a need for more clarity about the definition. But the answer to your question in narrow terms is that the target is the number of homes delivered through the Affordable Housing Supply Programme.
You mentioned that the target was set in 2011. What was the previous target?
I'll ask the team to come in. We're not aware that there was a specific target in relation to this, convener, but and we can double check that for you. But I'll just
was there
ask
not a
the
commitment
team.
made in 2007 in relation to socially rented housing?
We just
But we've looked at this particular target and the background to how some of the thinking was established for the affordable homes target. So we make reference in the report to the research that was carried out on behalf of the Scottish Government in 2005, which looked at how many homes at that point in time they estimated were needed to be built for affordable housing across Scotland. We've not reported on any of the other targets as part of this report, and we could come back to you about whether there's any other information underlying that, but we were looking at this particular target at this point in time.
Yeah, you know, I may be wrong, but I thought there had originally been a target set around about 2007 of homes for social renting, and then in 2011 it changed to being socially affordable housing with a different, complex, obscure definition. But you're not aware of what had previously been said in relation to aspirations in socially rented housing?
As part of this
report. Right, okay. Can you open up to committee? Bob, Doris?
I suppose I'm just going to seek further clarity, Convener. So my understanding is, I don't want to get hung up on it because there's other questions I want to ask, is that affordable homes will be defined in whatever the Scottish Government decides to spend its affordable homes investment budget on. Okay. But so it's about how you monitor, but actually I think there's a serious note to this. I'm not trying to seek to state the obvious, but an affordable home to one person might very well be not be an affordable home to someone else, because people are at a variety of income levels, and that's important. So it's about monitoring how this, for me, how the Scottish Government is using that budget to make homes more affordable for people. The second thing I think the convener said I was interested in was in terms of there's a disconnect between that and new homes. This is a question, I don't know the answer. The budget, the affordable homes budget, does all of that go into new build homes, or does it go into elsewhere? Because I want to make sure we're looking at the same thing. By affordable homes, are we talking about new build completions that the Scottish Government helps subsidise, or are we talking about a wider range of investment in affordable housing?
Take your first point about affordability varies depending on income and house prices. That's something that we do raise in the report, and there's quite variation in rent levels across the country, and reduced subsidies and tightening budgets will have an impact on rent levels. So the report does call for sort of greater clarity and thinking about going forward what is an affordable rent level, because affordability is not defined in terms of rent specifically. In terms of the affordable houses budget and whether that is just new builds, it's wider than new builds, because it will include properties that can be bought under the shared equity schemes.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. So we can't make a direct comparison between new build social housing and the extent to which the Scottish Government's extended affordable housing in the country. They are quite clearly two separate things. Now, I'm going to ask a question about housing association grant funding, HAG funding, not from the report, because the report is a bit complex and impenetrable in some respects. I used to sit in the local government committee in the last session, before I moved on to other committees this session, and there was always a debate with the social housing sector about the level of HAG grants to make social housing affordable, a business model for them to build new start social housing. And with a 36% cut in the Scottish Government's capital budget from the UK Government, there was clearly always going to be less money to be spent on new build social housing, and some of that clearly did feed through, and it's in your report, to the level of funding for new build social housing. So one of the things the Scottish Government did was to reduce the average level of subsidy, but it has recently been increased again, nowhere near the initial levels of subsidy, but increased again by £16,000. Do you have any comment to make in terms of how the Scottish Government has used evidence within the barriers to new build in the social housing sector to which they responded by increasing by £16,000. Can I just caveat that by saying, on one level, the less of a subsidy you give the social housing sector per unit, by definition, the more social housing completions you get and the more affordable houses there are within the sector. So I'm actually always keen to see HAG monies as low as possible, quite frankly, because you get more completions out of it. So this increase by £16,000, was it an evidence-led approach to increasing the subsidy in the social rented sector?
I'll again ask the team to comment. I think my caveat would be that we haven't covered that in the report because it happened after we'd done the work effectively. So obviously this is a very fast-moving picture, and we keep up as best we can. But there's no doubt that they, as I said in my introduction, certainly looked at the levels of resourcing and funding available to RSLs and councils in terms of new build. There was a working group, I think, set up to look at that, that carried out its work, I think, over the springtime of this year, which resulted in a recommendation to Scottish Government, which then resulted in the additional £16,000 per unit subsidy. So I don't know if the team want to say a wee bit more about that, but that's the broad picture, Mr Doris.
That's right. There was a working group established, and the report fed back to the Scottish Government that there needed to be an increase, and also interestingly highlighted that there needed to be some consistency over a longer period of time in that regard. And the sense there was echoed concerns that have been expressed by the Scottish Housing Regulator about the pressures on the housing sector across Scotland, and the need for changes to the resources that are available around housing in terms of meeting targets going forward. That was a particular concern, and the government reacted to that report, and that's why we see the increase in subsidy that's come through.
Yeah, I think one thing I want to add is to say that gives me some reassurance, because whilst I said I'd like HAG levels to be as low as they possibly can be, it's about getting an appropriate balance for HAG to allow development to continue to take place in an appropriate manner in the social rented sector. And from the evidence I'm hearing from yourselves this morning, the government has responded based on the auditable numbers that are there from the sector. And I wish I could ask more questions, but I genuinely find the report quite hard to penetrate to be focused in my questioning. So I think no more questions, Convener.
Okay, thank you. Tavish Scott.
Come to the defence of Audit Scotland and the Accounts Commission. I thought it was an admirably clear report, and it's what, to my reading, the report has found is how unclear things are, and that's hardly Audit Scotland or the Accounts Commission's fault. But can I just pick up Bob Doris's very interesting question there, just very briefly, before I come on to the other thing I wanted to ask about HAG. I take your point, Mr McKinley, that you haven't looked into this in depth, but did you find, when you were looking into this, that there are regional variations across Scotland? A one-size-fits-all approach on a £40,000 or a £56,000 subsidy per house, as Mary Scanlon I might reflect, is very different in Colonsay from Glasgow. And I wouldn't begin to make a judgment about housing costs in Glasgow, but did you find, when you looked at this, that one-size-fits-all approach does not help housing associations in different parts of Scotland with, frankly, different pressures that they face?
I'll ask Claire to come in there, Mr Scott, if that's okay.
Of course.
Yes, that's right. That issue did come up in quite a few different aspects of this piece of work. And one other issue that was raised was around the planning arrangements and how money is allocated across Scotland. I mean, certainly we were quite interested, although this isn't an audit of what was happening in each local area across Scotland, just to make that clear. But what came through quite strongly was the different pressures in different areas. So we've tried to highlight a couple of examples in the report that bring that to life a little bit more. So, for example, some of the tensions around Aberdeen, for example, in terms of job creation, the links of housing to the local economy, and I think our challenge would be to what extent is the way that the public resources are being used mapped to where that's most needed and relative to the local circumstances. So I think that is an important point.
That's very helpful. Which drags me on to the second question, which is about Exhibit 9 on page 24. There are, if I add them up, 25 separate funding streams. I just wonder why you didn't make a recommendation about simplifying what must be a pretty complex picture, even for the most clever of housing professionals anywhere in Scotland.
I mean, I think there's no doubt that, as that exhibit and a couple of others demonstrate, it is very, very complex. And one of the things that the housing sector have said to us in producing this report is that, in a sense, it's the first time that anyone's actually tried to do it and to get it on a single page, and that has been not a straightforward task. If that recommendation doesn't come through clearly enough, then again, I think that's something we can reflect on, Mr Scott. I think there is definitely something here about making it more understandable. I would also say, though, that, as I said in my introduction, there is no easy option. There is no silver bullet that's going to fix all of this. And so I think it is about, and this is the point around leadership, I think, about Scottish Government being clearer about the funding streams, how funding is available, in particular the new models of funding, which are not new in themselves, but are new to the housing sector. And if you're a community-based housing association with 200 houses wanting to build some more houses, you're going to struggle to get your head around, and for that matter, so are some of the bigger housing associations and councils. But there is a real capacity building issue in this, I think, for housing associations and councils to help them understand the complexity of the landscape. And clearly, if there are opportunities to simplify it, then that would be a good thing too.
Okay, and therefore paragraph 38 on the previous page, which describes in your language the fact that some schemes have not been evaluated but then changed, would be surely a failure of the public pound. I mean, that presumably means either that's... Did you assess why those schemes were changed?
I'll ask Claire to come in the detail, but I suppose we just don't know, is our point. We don't know if it was good or bad or indifferent because they didn't evaluate it, and the world had then moved on. And I think there is something about how are we ensuring, how is the Scottish Government and councils ensuring that we are getting absolutely the best bang for our buck out of the spend in all its complexity on social housing.
Do you know how many schemes were, in the language of paragraph 38, not evaluated and then changed?
That is quite a common thread throughout much of what we looked at in this report. I think there's two additional things to mention. One is this need for more consistency and stability over time. Housing is a significant national asset that requires a long-term investment, so it's not something that can be dealt with on a short-term basis. But I think also just to mention that what we've seen about, and there are other exhibits in the report that show money coming in throughout the year, is an attempt to, where there is money available, to try and then put it into the housing sector. So that's a good thing. I think what we're arguing for is, yes, that's fine, but actually you need to have quite a clear, sustained and clear and transparent plan over a length of time that enables the housing sector to deal with the priorities that it's facing.
That's fine. Would you be so good as to furnish the committee with how many schemes did change and then were not evaluated over the period of the inquiry that you carried out?
Certainly look at that.
Okay, sure. Thank you. The last question I had, Convener, just on that, you make a point in the very last sentence of 38, preparing bids can be time-consuming and costly, particularly for smaller organisations. Is your view that in coming up with these new financial models, that very fair point will be taken into account, and will you recommend in the work you do with government in simplifying, and I can't urge that enough, in simplifying the structure here, that instead of it coming up with 27 more funding streams, they actually work this down into a number that are easily digestible, and they are very conscious of the small organisations that have to bid for them?
Yeah, I think that would be a really important part of the process from now on. I think the specific point around the newer models of funding isn't necessarily so much the complexity in terms of the number of different sources. It is understanding the complexity in terms of risk, in terms of how, particularly smaller organisations, what they're actually taking on and going through that process.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Colin Keir.
Thank you. My comments or questions really are based around the far end, talking about welfare reform as is going through just now. And obviously, you've got a couple of comments on 54, 55 in the booklet, but there's also a comment somewhere or other that does say something along the lines of there has to be rent rises considered and all this sort of thing. In terms of a longer spiel, is there anything out with the notes that you actually have in 54, 55 that we should be really digging into and getting information on, because it's a little bit limited what you're saying there, because this is obviously something that is having a pretty drastic effect right now, and we'd like to see how it carries on in a sort of more longer term.
I think the short answer, Mr Keir, to your question about is there more to be said is yes, there almost certainly will be more to be said. This report, as I mentioned, is the first time we've tried to take an overview of the housing sector, and so we haven't gone into depth on the impact of welfare reform, partly because it's quite new and it's still a very emerging picture. But in a different part of our work, we have undertaken a survey of councils and their preparedness for welfare reform. There's no doubt that every council in the land has this as one of its top 1 or 2 risks about welfare reform generally, and in particular the spare room subsidy and the impact that that's going to have on rent arrears and other things. And that's even before you get into some of the longer term issues around what it means for their housing stock and the different nature of houses that might be required in future. So we could and we may in the future look in more detail about welfare reform and its impact on housing, but you're right to say that we haven't done so much of that in here.
Well, okay, I'll leave the next one, I think.
Can I just follow on that one? You know, you've spoken about the implications for local authorities of the bedroom tax or spare bedroom subsidies, you call it. I think that's right, and a lot of councils will be feeling a lot of financial pressure, but they're better able to cope with that than a lot of the smaller housing associations. Have you looked at what the consequences could be for those housing associations? Because they're more exposed to bank borrowing and to borrowing from other sources, and if they can't keep up their repayments because of reductions in income, then potentially they face going out of business in a way that a local authority would not go out of business. They could be open to takeovers from larger housing organisations from elsewhere in the country. Has there been any study of what it might mean for the housing association sector?
Again, I'll ask the team to come in, but this is really the core work of our colleagues in the Scottish Housing Regulator. Convener, the SHR are very acutely aware of this, and this has been their main priority really for certainly the last couple of years. It is looking at the potential impact of some of this stuff on housing associations, and particularly some of the smaller ones. As you say, the business model for housing associations has been pretty soundly based for a very long time, and this is introducing a pretty significant change to that. And particularly for some of the smaller ones, the margins are very, very tight. It doesn't take much in terms of reduction in rent coming in, or you know, an increase in rent arrears, for that to have a pretty fundamental impact on the business model for some smaller associations. So colleagues in SHR are acutely aware of it and have been doing some work on it.
We spoke to some housing regulators, some housing associations as part of the audit, and by far and away that was the biggest risk that they mentioned to us right at the outset. It was a consistent concern for them. We've worked very closely with the Scottish Housing Regulator in producing this report, and many of their recent reports highlight the pressures on the housing regulators around welfare reform, and it is something they're keeping a very close eye on. But it is a big concern for some of the smaller housing associations.
Is that a specific piece of work which you might look into, what the implications will be for housing associations financially?
On that specific thing, that would be more likely to be the regulator, because SHR have responsibility for oversight of the housing association sector. We don't audit the RSLs directly. We can do this kind of work, which is a whole systems piece of work, but in terms of individual housing associations, that would be colleagues in SHR.
Right. Okay.
Really? Just to follow on your point you made there, I do know that a couple of housing associations in my constituency are already reporting a drop in demand for some of the higher number bedroom properties that they have in their stock, and clearly the consequential effect that will have in their rent income revenue stream. But they also appear to be trying to take some steps, convener, to, I don't know if reconfigure or redesignate is the word that we can use to alter the number of bedrooms that are in a house to try and overcome this daft UK policy that we're facing at the moment. So I think it would be a useful piece of work just to see what the impact of that is, medium to long term, on stock levels, particularly for housing associations, and how they're dealing with this situation, because it seems to be quite serious. I mean, and your report goes on to talk about the expected increase in number of single person households anyway over the next 20 years, and all of that in the policy context, Hugh, I think is worthy of a further piece of work in this subject.
I know that your remit is slightly different, but I do wonder whether there might be some opportunity for joint activity with the regulator, where the regulator can look at specifically the housing aspect, but you can look at the financial implications, because, you know, increased financial problems, potentially housing association getting out of business, has got huge financial repercussions. So it might be useful to see whether there's some joint report that could be done.
We can come at that a number of ways. I think obviously as we think about what else we might do in the back of this report, we'll be working very closely with colleagues in SHR on deciding what we do next, and then potentially working with them. And we already have in our Prospective Forward programme some piece of work around welfare reform, still to decide how best to get into that very big subject. But it is clearly such a significant issue and risk for the public sector at the moment that it's on our radar already for future reports.
Okay, thanks. Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Mayor. I was looking at page 37, and basically 79, 80 and 81, 81 in particular. It's a fairly alarming figure, that, for councils. I mean, we're looking at the spend on management, repairs, investment and lost income through empty properties, which are the day-to-day things that council manage. We're saying that the council income will be 1.9 billion less than is needed to cover the costs of existing stock, whereas RSLs will have an excess of 3.9 billion. Do councils have robust enough systems to be able to make these projections on their own, which would obviously inform the way that they handle their investment in their properties?
This piece of work we undertook to try and to try and look to see if there were any issues we could draw out from comparing how the two parts of the sector operated. So we took estimates and used some indicative figures in there to try and draw that out. We didn't look at local services in great levels of detail as part of the report, but what we did was we drew on published information to give an indication as to how well RSLs and councils were managing their housing stock, and think about what the implications might be in a financial sense over the longer time. So we thought it was quite a useful approach just to try and give an indication of any issues and any lessons that could be learnt between the two sectors. We've shared the information with the Scottish Housing Regulator, and they were quite interested in the methodology and thinking about any lessons for the RSL and for the local authority sector going forward. So this shows projections over 30 years, and it looks at all things being equal when we know that there are differences between the RSL and local authority sectors, so there are big differences. In essence, the biggest differences are that generally council rental income is lower, and they tend to spend more on reactive repairs than RSLs, and councils generally have longer void terms, so empty properties. But there is variation across the whole of Scotland in terms of whether you are a council or an RSL. There's still variations across it geographically. So we thought it was just an indication, but quite a useful start to get into looking at some of the issues, trying to compare the RSL and council sectors.
I mean, you mentioned here about higher subsidies and so on, but you do say that the financial relationship between income and expenditure is directly comparable.
What we're trying to get at there is we thought there were some issues around to what extent the longer-term financial planning around the housing. We've highlighted in the report housing is a significant national asset, so it needs to be invested in. So we were quite interested to try and draw out if people were taking a longer-term view of the houses. It's also quite interesting looking at the role of the Scottish Housing Regulator in terms of the financial health and strength of the RSL sector, and we thought there were probably some things that could be learnt between the two. So really this was just a start to get into some of that agenda. We didn't look at services at a local level, but just to try and draw out if there were any lessons that could be learnt between the two.
Earlier we were talking about smaller RSLs and the financial threat to them, and yet this would seem to indicate that overall the RSL sector is actually fairly robust.
I think it depends on the time frame you're looking at, Mr.
We're looking at 30 years and it's comparable.
Indeed, and so on that basis, I think, as Claire has tried to describe, there are interesting differences in how they manage their stock, and I think there are lessons to be learned there about ensuring that you're investing now to ensure that the stock is well maintained and will continue to be in good condition into the future. At para 82, we just highlight the fact that obviously the Scottish Social Housing Charter includes this kind of issue around how RSLs and councils manage their stock, and again, colleagues in SHR will be doing a report on that next year, which will give us a good sense, I think, of how they're progressing. But again, that's something we can continue to keep an eye on around the sector, within the housing sector, the different providers and how they're managing their stock.
I realise that there's obviously a lot of estimates and so on you put into this, but you made it you say comparable for RSLs and for councils. Again, I would say, do councils have the tools to do this projection themselves? I mean, we've got here, you're saying there's going to be 1.9 billion shortfall over the period of 30 years, which is not a small sum. Presumably that's 1.9 billion in current funding. So how are you going to, what are you going to do with that?
We've shared the methodology. The methodology is there. That's on our website. More detail underlying these figures, and certainly something that anyone could run, because the figures were drawn from publicly available information. So there is a model there that can be used by others to try and get into that. I mean, in terms of the RSL sector, it's also probably worth mentioning the difference in scale between RSLs. The difference, some of them being very, very big organisations and some of them very, very small and very local. And it's another tension that came through quite clearly in carrying out this piece of work. Some of the very local, very small are focused on community capacity building, regeneration issues in a local community. There's a risk for those smaller ones in terms of the financial climate and in going forward dealing with welfare reform, some of the issues that have been talked about. So I think we're quite interested in what does the RSL sector look like going forward, given the financial pressures. That range of different types of organisations is something that needs to be thought about, and we make reference to that in the report as well.
Have you thought or considered the possibility of making this calculation part of the audit of councils, which would give the councils some information, comfort, whatever, to do to see the projections going forward?
I'm conscious, Mr. Beattie, that it feels like I'm not answering your question properly, but I'm struggling to understand why that is. I think in terms of process, the councils will routinely get external advice and expertise around the value of stock and what needs to be spent on it. So I don't think we would have any, if this is part of the question, any concern about the process that councils go through to ascertain those numbers themselves.
My concern is, we're told here that there's going to be a deficit in council income over a period. They're going to make a loss in their housing, which they'll have to absorb.
Yeah.
How do we feed that into the council's process?
Right.
Because clearly, whatever they're doing now isn't throwing that up. Otherwise, they would be reacting to it. So how do we get this into their process so that they can react to it? And they've got 30 years to fix it. So sure. It's not a crisis that's going to hit tomorrow.
Yeah, and certainly, as we do with all our reports, certainly when they're joint or General Commission reports, we engage with COSLA as part of this exercise. We've been involved in the advisory group. So local government have already had input to this and are obviously very aware of what's in there, and this will be part of our follow-up work that we routinely do as part of our impact reporting. I guess it's not necessarily the case that councils don't get it. It is the reality of having to make some very difficult decisions on how they spend their money year to year, and even recognising that number, how they then make progress against that is obviously a difficult question given the competing challenges they've got on the resources.
It is something that local authority colleagues that we engaged with as part of the piece of work were very interested in terms of what lay beyond this and some of the issues that threw up. And one of the issues that throws up are issues around rent levels across Scotland, and we've touched on that in the report as well. So there, that is part of the mix. It's not just about the other financial flaws that are involved in the housing system, but it also is about local decisions about rent policies and how that works at a local level. So there's quite a lot of different factors that need to be taken into account. But I think the messages have been received by people, and the Scottish Housing Regulator understands the methodology we used and some of the tensions that lie within that. So it is something of interest that we'll probably keep an eye on going forward, and particularly in terms of thinking about the impact that the report has, where it goes next. Definitely something we want to keep an eye on.
Mary Scanlon, then Ken McIntyre.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you, Colin, for taking my question. It reduces my time, which is fine. The top of page 29, you're telling us that it's not clear, so I'm not sure if my questioning is going to make it any clearer, but I do feel it's an issue that I should raise, and I'll quote from the report. The Scottish Government is promoting alternative models of finance, but these carry risks, and the extent to which they can compensate for reduced levels of subsidy is not clear. Now, you're already telling us it's not clear, so I'm asking for a bit more clarity, which seems a contradiction in terms. But, you know, I've heard this in Parliament, in the Chambers so often, and, you know, just from the questions that I've heard, I thought the government seemed confident about the way they were moving forward with this form of funding. But this certainly causes me considerable concern. If it's not clear to Audit Scotland, how clear is it to councils and RSLs? So can you help?
I'll do my best.
And also
Ms.
about
Scanlon.
the risks. I'm concerned about
Sure.
the risks.
I mean, I think the point we're making here is that, first of all, there is a gap in terms of the amount of housing we need and the amount that are being built. And that gap is trying to be filled in what is a very difficult financial climate for housing. So to that end, I think the Scottish Government are right to be looking at different ways of trying to do that, hence the alternative funding model. So we are not in any way criticising per se the use of these things. You need to find a way of trying to plug the gap. I guess what we're saying is it's just too early to say. We don't have enough evidence yet to say whether the take-up of these alternative models of finance is going to be sufficient to plug the gap and to make good, if you like, the reduced level of subsidy, even with the increase that's been announced more recently. So, as you say, that's why we say it's not clear, because it's not clear yet. It may be, excuse me, in a year, 2 years' time or something, we may have more evidence and we may be able to say more about that. I guess our recommendation, therefore, is that, given that the Scottish Government has said that this is a potential solution to plug in the gap, we think there's greater support and leadership required on their part to help councils and RSLs get to grips with alternative models of funding and actually take them up and start using them. There's a big capacity building question in there for all housing associations and councils, but I think particularly smaller ones, to really understand what are really I don't even begin to pretend to understand the bond market and all that stuff. And I think therefore it's important that the social housing sector is helped along the road if that is seen to be part of the solution.
My second question was on leadership, because it's a constant theme throughout this report that there's a lack of leadership, and also under planning and management at part 3, you say a lack of leadership, and Mr McKinlay at the beginning in your opening comments you said there was a lack of leadership. So if I can go back, I think you did clearly explain why it's not clear, but you didn't clearly explain the risks. You obviously have some information that has led you to highlight to this committee or in this report that the alternative models of funding by the Scottish Government carry risks. And my second point is, where is the leadership not coming from? Where should the leadership be coming from? That is, Tabby Scott and Bob Doris have talked about the complexities of this report, and it is a bit of a muddle. So who should be leading this? And the second point is the risks.
So I'll start on the leadership question, and the team can come in on more specifics around the risks. I think that the leadership question comes on a number of levels. I think we've tried to be reasonably specific in the report where we think Scottish Government has a role around leadership. One would be around the alternative models of finance that we've spoken about.
Should be leading. Is this what we're seeing? Is there a lack of leadership from ministerial?
As I say, I think we've been quite specific in the report that there is a job for stronger leadership from Scottish Government around helping councils and RSLs understand and use alternative models of finance more effectively. and that would be leadership at one level. The point we make later on around the extent to which housing is playing its full part in and is well connected to other policies, I think is partly a Scottish Government issue and partly a local issue. If I think just back to the community planning work we've done recently in 3 places in Scotland, housing wasn't strongly enough or at a strategic enough level plugged into that community planning kind of framework, if you like, locally. So when we talk about stronger local and national leadership later on in the report, that's the kind of thing we're getting at there. It's about being much clearer about the role housing can play in improved health and improved well-being, the economy and those kinds of things.
That's page 30. The Scottish Government should provide leadership under the recommendations there.
Yeah.
Maybe I missed it, but have you... What about the risks? What are the risks?
Yeah, I'll ask the team to come on to those now. Yeah.
Thank you.
The risks are largely financial. I think what we're seeing in the report is that it's a challenging environment anyway, and that this is one option. So it's not to say that there aren't risks with taking other approaches, but clearly there are financial risks around some of the newer alternative models of financing. The risks change over time and they depend on a range of different factors. There are different mechanisms, financial mechanisms that can be used, and each of those have their own set of different risks and challenges. But in terms of some of the common issues, I mean, really what we're talking about is risks around stock, risks around underwriting guarantees and the financial impact that could have if those go wrong. There are risks around effects on the market potentially. So there's a whole raft of different issues that need to be taken into account depending on which type of model people might want to pursue. The issues about what that means for rental income, the condition of stock, existing loans and covenants, they all have to be taken into account before determining whether it's a viable option going forward. But there are lessons from elsewhere. There are lessons from other parts of the public sector. There are lessons from England, from overseas. Some lessons about what went wrong, instances where things haven't worked out. But there's certainly an appetite there, and it's something that other bits of the public sector are more familiar with. So it's something new for housing.
What you're saying is that the paragraph 59, many councils and RSAs lack experience and expertise in alternative financing model, coupled with the risk that you mention, that obviously is where the leadership is needed and the comfort there. Just my final question, Convener, is Exhibit 7, page 21. Why is there 9 million more announced funding than in reality? How did that happen? How can the government announce 9 million more than actually exists?
We're going to come back here probably to the message that previously about the confusion in terms of bits of funding being announced and whether that's something that's been announced before or as part of another package. It was quite a challenge just getting to this point to try and articulate the changes to the funding arrangements over time. So there are 2 things going on within the report. One thing is trying to set out the top line figures at that point in time, but this exhibit particularly was trying to sort of illuminate a little bit about all of the changes over time that were going on within those 2 year period.
So you think this may not be an accurate figure? That
there may also be something about the fact
it's not a huge amount, but it's still significant.
Sure, that we're looking at 2 different years in those 2 lines, Mrs. Cann, if I'm understanding it correctly, your point correctly. The announcements from 12-13, and then that's the 13-14 affordable housing supply budget line. So again, I think it's. I mean, I made the point earlier slightly flippantly, but this is a good example of, for us who spend a lot, I say us, for the team who spend a lot of time trying to get underneath this stuff, this page was incredibly difficult to come to because, and the reason we mention the announcement stuff is that an awful lot of it does come
it's difficult
through announcements in Parliament and other places, so we've had to spend a lot of time piecing it together. But it's a very good question, and I think we'll
try to balance the between the announcement and the actuality.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Ken McIntosh and Miller Coffee.
All right, thank you, Convener. Can I just ask, one of the worrying conclusions of the report is that we're not going to meet demand within over the next 20 years. How will that reveal itself? Will it be, I don't know, you talk about more kids living with their parents? I just say that because I've got 6 kids, that's all. What a frightening prospect.
That's a couple of extra huts.
I know. The sheds are going up in the garden as we speak. But I mean, to be more serious, though, does it actually mean people living in unsuitable accommodation? How will this reflect itself? Longer waiting lists than already exist?
And I'll ask the team come in, Mr. McIntosh. I've only got 3 kids, so maybe not quite as in quite as bad shape as you. But I mean, I think it's difficult to tell. It may well be a combination of all the things you've mentioned. I think we've effectively what we've tried to do in this section is hold the mirror up to the Scottish Government and to the public sector, taking the research that was done back in 2005 and said this is how it's going, and the evidence is that there's a real gap, and we've tried to map the trend on a best case, an average case, and a worst case scenario. So obviously over that time period, lots of stuff can change. But certainly the signs are at the moment that we're not going to have enough houses unless we do something really quite different to meet need, both in overall number terms and also in terms of the shifting demographic and the implications that has for housing stock. So I'm not sure I can answer your question in terms of what that will actually look like, but I think it may well be a combination of those things.
Clearly there's an impact of the current recession. That's one part of it, but you seem to be suggesting, however, that it needs a different kind of approach. In other words, it's more structural than just a particular recession. It's an ongoing issue that won't go away with if the economy picks up. Is that right?
I think the economy has, in what's happened since 2007-8, has made it much more difficult to make the kind of progress, and that's absolutely clear. And I think, to be fair, the Scottish Government have been responding to that and trying to introduce new initiatives and different ways of trying to generate that on the supply side, generate more house building, and the financing that was spoken about is one example of that. I don't know if the team want to add to that.
I think, again, back to this issue about it being very difficult with the information we had, but we highlight in the report that there are still shortfalls with that. So, for example, some of the issues that have been raised about people living alone, living longer, we're not cited on information that gives more detail about people with particular disabilities and the needs that might lead to for a different type of housing. The ageing population will have an impact. So I think there are a whole raft of different challenges that the housing sector in its broadest sense is facing across Scotland, and we tried to emphasise that quite clearly in the report, and that although there were challenges around the recession and about the actual amount of housing stock and how suitable that stock is, it's a challenging time for housing in Scotland.
A very brief point on that. You measure completions. Do you measure new starts as well?
The Scottish Government does, as part of its database, it looks at starts, completions, approvals.
Did you look at it?
For the purposes of this report, we focused on completions, so the number of houses built.
Okay. There's a particularly alarming figure on page 17, Exhibit 6, on fuel poverty. Just when you say that in 2002 there were 13% of people living in fuel poverty, and in 2011 30%. Are you confident that that's going to be reduced, or it's going to continue increasing?
That's one of many issues in the report that we could have carried out more work around. This is an overview of housing in Scotland, so we've tried to reflect all of the different elements of housing policy and the breadth and complexity of the housing sector. So there are a few different issues in the report that could well have had much more of a focus on. So there are issues around homelessness, issues around capacity within the sector, the new build programme, and fuel poverty is an issue as well. So we've drawn issues out that we thought was significant enough to warrant a place in a report like this, but doubtless there is a big story behind quite a lot of the issues that are raised in the report.
There's a target here in fuel poverty to abolish it by 2016. Is that even remotely possible?
I mean, I don't think we're in a position to say whether it is or it isn't possible at this stage. I think that's a good example, though, for me of how housing is very, very central to a whole bunch of other stuff. I mean, how that target around fuel poverty won't only be, and where that's headed in the wrong direction isn't just about housing. There'll be a whole bunch of stuff happening that will be contributing to that, and that's why we think it's important that the housing element of public policy, particularly when looking at improving outcomes and reducing inequality and issues like fuel poverty, is absolutely central and needs to be more central, I think.
Did you look, one of the parts of that would be retrofitting, trying to improve the energy, trying to improve the energy efficiency of existing and older housing stock. Is that something you looked at all? Because, yeah.
And as we mentioned in the report, in response partly to the fuel poverty and the targets around energy emissions, the government is currently considering increasing energy efficiency standards further for homes. So there already is a energy efficiency standard for all council and RSL homes that they have to meet, and they're now looking at trying to increase that further to try and help address these issues.
In terms of existing, particularly even in the private sector, is that something you would look at? Existing older properties in the private sector, which would be the majority of Scottish housing, I would have thought. Did you look at that?
Standards are just for the social housing sector.
But we do raise issue in the report about the challenges around the state of private housing stock and any implications that might have in a broader sense. So it's something we were aware of. I think for this report focused on public finances and the resources in the public sector, we couldn't ignore the significant part of the private sector, so we've tried to bring that in where it was relevant. So there is something later on in the report about the state of private housing stock and any implications that might have for the public sector and for housing more generally.
Just on the way that, just the way that the public finances are used to support private sector, most of the public finances are used to support new build. Did you look at this at all? And as far as I'm aware, in Scotland, none of the public finances are designed to, that there's support there to try and spark private purchasing of housing. But it's all of new build, whereas I think in the rest of the UK it's actually you can buy older homes as well. Is that something that you looked at? Or the effectiveness of these programmes, or their uptake, or whether they're good value for money?
We didn't detail its schemes up to that level of...
The new money that's just been announced earlier this week, that includes to help first-time buyers buy homes and second-time buyers move on to new homes. So there is an element of that will be for older properties.
Some of that's for older properties, is it?
Yes, so a first-time buyer could. That's my understanding of what's announced.
First-time buyers, right.
Yeah. But the second stepper has to buy a new property.
Yes, that's right.
And then the first-time buyer can buy that.
Right. Well, I only had one question for the task convener, but I'll let you.
Okay, final question, Willie Coffey.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Convener. Convener, I think we're in a good place in terms of the performance in house building in Scotland over the past period, despite the recession that's been mentioned by a few people, and despite huge cuts in capital and revenue budgets of up to something like 29%. I think the achievements the Scottish Government the last few years has been pretty good, and I've got 3 figures here from my own information and research. In terms of shared equity schemes, I mean, I'll try and use terminology that I think I understand. There's been 6,000 people or families been able to buy in terms of shared equity schemes in the last 6 years. There's been 30,000 new houses built in terms of the social housing definition of that, and probably, as far as I'm concerned, in terms of council house building, Convener, which is close to my heart, I used to be housing spokesperson for my group in East Ayrshire. There's been nearly 4,000 new council houses built, and I was always one to try to persuade people, particularly in my constituency, to continue to rent, because it's a really attractive option for the future, and it became more so, Convener, I think, as the recession bit hard. So I don't think it's any surprise that because of the recession there was an attempt by the Scottish Government to try to remodel how some of these...
Is there a question for Audit Scotland? Or?
Aye, yes, right. Yes. It's important to make these points, I think, given others have had the chance to make the points that they make. What worries me more in the long term, of course, is that whether supply can meet demand, and Mr McIntosh started talking about that there. And Auditor General, your own report does point to the fact that there'll be more single people living in households over the coming years. I'm worried about that and the long-term planning for that. Perhaps it could have been a stronger message in the report to to say to Scottish Government and other partners that we need to get together to think about this much more forcibly over the next few years. I'm worried too, Convener, about the impact of these changes, particularly benefit changes in the private rented sector, and their ability to meet the Scottish housing quality standards, which, as I understand, there's no requirement for them to do that at the moment. So I'm worried about the impacts in the long term, Convener, and I think there's a good piece of work that either we or one of our subject committees could do here in that regard. And I think overall, though, I think the performance over the past few years has been pretty good.
No question.
Stunned silence.
We're waiting for the question.
Well, the question is about
discuss.
The question is about looking to the future.
So if I take the bit about the long-term issue there, Mr. Coffey, I mean, absolutely. I think when we, and again, we can reflect on how we've worded the recommendations. I think when we talk about how the long-term vision underpins national policies and informs local planning and practice, and when we talk about having a need for a clearer strategy, I think that's exactly the kind of thing we're getting at. So again, to reiterate something I said earlier, there is a lot of activity, there is a lot of innovative thinking going on in very difficult circumstances. We've spoken about Exhibit 6, which all of which are very good things in their own right, but they've come along at a time when money's reducing and it's becoming more difficult to get funding for housing. It's also worth, I think, just referring to Exhibit 5 in this context, which demonstrates that just the structure of housing has changed beyond all recognition virtually since you go back to early 2000s when you look at how many council and RSL homes we used to have. So it's a very, very different world, and that discussion around the future and how we meet the need is absolutely one that we would encourage Scottish Government, councils, RSLs and others to get around the table and start really thrashing out. Yeah.
Looked at private, well, you don't look at the private rented sector and the standards that we would expect there. Somebody has to look at that, Convener, and whether it's us or another committee, I think that bit of work needs to be done because of the impact of many of the changes that we're seeing just now.
Audit Scotland has, looked at housing from a very specific point of view, and you've looked at the Scottish Government targets and budgets. But the point that Willie Coffey makes, I think, is a relevant one, that there are more people now being pushed towards the private sector for whatever reason, and that has got a significant cost to the public purse. Is that something that you think could fall within your remit for some future work?
I mean, I think it's worth bearing in mind, for example, that locally councils are the strategic housing authority for the area, and they need to look at the housing system in the round. And the Exhibit 1 at the start of the report, it's worth bearing in mind that over 3/4 of housing in the country is in private hands. Interestingly, the real change has been around owner-occupied rather than private rent, which has actually come down since the 1970s. So it's kind of it's clearly not something we can go and do directly because our job is about public spend. But in terms of our whole systems work, we would certainly be looking at how Scottish Government and councils are reflecting the private sector and the market, if you like, in shaping what they can do. And I think even then you can see real shifts over the last few years about the extent to which government is trying to influence, shape, intervene in the private market, and we've seen some announcements around that recently in a way that you wouldn't have done some years ago. So I think it's already shifting, and that clearly is something as part of our work we will continue to track and monitor. But just to be clear, I don't think we could go in and do a specific audit about the quality of private sector rented accommodation. That wouldn't be our remit.
Except that, and I know that the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee is going to be looking at the proposed housing bill, and there will be a number of issues to do with the private rented sector there. But I was thinking about the financial implications for the public purse, and given the changes in the way that housing benefit is being managed, the increase in numbers, I know just from my constituency, number of people in private rented houses is increasing, and the rents are significantly higher than either in the housing association or in the council sector. Now that will impact on the housing benefit budget, so perhaps there's maybe something that you should keep your eye on, and if there's a relevant contribution you could make to the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee, I'm sure it would be appreciated. Okay, right, thank you very much for that. Again, I think it just shows the interest and challenges that there are in housing. Next item on our agenda is Section 23 report again on renewable energy. I can invite Caroline Gardner to brief the committee.
Thank you, Convener. The Scottish Government estimates that renewable energy could deliver up to £30 billion worth of investment and 40,000 jobs in Scotland by 2020. In addition, renewable energy could contribute to reducing emissions and providing a more secure energy supply. The Government wants renewable sources to meet 30% of Scotland's energy use by 2020. Realising the potential of renewable energy is central to the Government's economic strategy and its goal of sustainable economic growth. Members will be aware that the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee conducted a wide-ranging inquiry into the targets for renewable energy last year. This report complements that inquiry by examining what the public sector has done to develop renewable energy, what investment it's made and what's been delivered to date. We focused on activity and investment by the Scottish Government, by Scottish Enterprise and Highlands and Islands Enterprise. It's worth noting that we didn't examine the role of the planning system or the consents process in assessing applications for renewable energy projects. Overall, we found that the Scottish Government is providing clear leadership, direction and ambition for the development of renewable energy. It's got a clear strategy to 2020, which is well linked to other policy areas such as housing and planning, and to the strategic priorities of other public bodies. The Government's targets for renewable energy demonstrate considerable ambition for the sector. In particular, renewable electricity, for which the 100% target is much higher than the UK Government's 30% target. The Scottish Government has made steady progress towards its targets, but achieving them will be challenging, and it relies on significant activity and investment over the next 7 years. The development of renewable energy relies largely on investment from the private sector. Attracting, encouraging and enabling this investment is the focus of activity and funding by the Scottish Government, Scottish Enterprise and Highlands and Islands Enterprise. For example, the two enterprise agencies have together invested £43 million in specific ports and harbours around Scotland to make them suitable for use by the offshore wind and marine energy industries. Collectively, the Government and the two enterprise agencies spent over £209 million on delivering renewable energy over the 11 years to March 2013. More than 90% of this, £193 million, was spent in the last 6 years since March 2007. And funding is increasing. Exhibit 6 on page 19 of the report illustrates the scale of this increase. The budget for the next 2 years, 2013-14 and 2014-15, totals £264 million, which is intended to lever in billions of pounds worth of private sector investment. However, the current financial climate is making potential investors more cautious. Uncertainty over reforms to UK energy policy, the cost and reliability of new technologies and access to the national grid are also delaying investment decisions. These issues are not exclusive to Scotland, and the Government is working with the UK Government to try to address them. We recommend that the Scottish Government and the two enterprise agencies should identify what specific additional steps they can take to accelerate progress, especially in relation to offshore wind. This uncertainty means that projects eligible for public sector funding are not progressing as quickly as anticipated, and public bodies are experiencing delays in spending some of the money available to them. When the Finance Secretary presented his draft budget for 2014-15 to the Parliament last month, he proposed that the £101 million budget for the Scottish Government's Renewable Energy Investment Fund should be extended over an extra year to 2015-16, reflecting this slower than expected progress. This is a positive report overall, but we do make 3 specific recommendations to build on the progress that's been achieved so far. First, total investment in the Scottish economy by the renewable energy industry isn't monitored, although Scottish Enterprise and Highlands and Islands Enterprise individually monitor private sector investment in the projects that they fund. We think that the Scottish Government should collate this information and report on a national level how much the private sector has invested in renewable energy projects that have received public funding. Second, as I mentioned earlier, the Government estimates that renewable energy could deliver up to 40,000 jobs by 2020. However, we found that the assumptions used to reach this estimate are based on optimistic scenarios. For example, 28,000 of the estimated 40,000 jobs are in the offshore wind sector, but this assumes there will be twice as much offshore wind capacity in 2020 than current industry estimates suggest. We therefore recommend that the Scottish Government should work with its partners to ensure that revised employment projections, which are due by the end of this year, are realistic. Finally, I'd like to highlight our recommendation that the Scottish Government sets out how it aims to develop renewable energy beyond 2020 and develops targets to reflect this. This will be important in demonstrating to potential investors the Government's long-term commitment to developing renewable energy. As ever, Convener, we'll be happy to try to answer the committee's questions.
Okay, thank you. I know it's not Audit Scotland's responsibility to recommend changes in policy, practice or priorities, but given the discussion that we've just had on housing, was any work done to estimate the financial benefit to both the individual households, but more significantly to the public purse, of implementing a change to housing policy and planning policy to require new build properties to have either certain minimum standards of insulation and or solar panels installed at the new build stage?
It's Mark to pick up that question based on what we do know about the Government's interrelationship between those two policy areas.
Excuse me, within the context of this audit, we didn't look at policies to encourage take-up of insulation or use of solar panels at the individual level. Obviously, those are important things in the government's wider low-carbon strategy and so forth, but not within the context of this audit and the work specifically of the two enterprise agencies, which was the primary focus.
I wasn't asking about steps to encourage. What I was asking was there any consideration given to the financial benefit to the public purse of investing higher insulation standards, but also maybe more significantly in solar panels at the new build stage, so that a requirement for a new build property, for example, might be that solar panels are installed as a matter of course, rather than encouraging the individual householder to apply for grants. Now, what would be the cost of that? What would be the long-term benefits, and what's the cost-benefit ratio? So is there any value to the management of public finances of doing it at the planning and construction stage, rather than have to react to encourage individual households to do it at a later stage?
I think that there's a really interesting piece of potential work to look at kind of what those longer term benefits might be if kind of building standards were changed to require higher insulation standards or renewable energy technologies. We didn't do any of those calculations within this piece of work or look at those potential changes. So I really couldn't comment any further on that.
Right. Bob Doris and then Mary Scanlon.
The convener, I think the convener makes an interesting point now, because it is an excellent report. I think what we're looking at next steps as much as we are about the content of the report itself is a very fair question. I'm going to tread delicately with the question I have, because similar to what the convener said, you could see an incentive for putting solar panels on new build houses, maybe like reducing VAT on it to incentivise that kind of thing. And I don't want to blur devolved and reserved. That's not the reason for asking the next question, but I do have a constituents interest in relation to a company called Gia Wind, who make small-scale wind turbines for farmers, for individual residents, and the business model around that is very much based on UK government feed-in tariffs to help subsidise that and bring it online. So, for example, recent changes in feed-in tariffs means that that micro-renewable, if you like, if that's what you want to call it, will pay for itself after 5 years, whereas previously the regime had it would pay for itself after 3 years. So I'm not going to drag in the details of the feed-in tariffs, but it is more about, did you do any work on the interaction of what the Scottish Government's doing in relation to their ambitions in renewable energy and auditing that and how it interacts with, if you like, policy decisions elsewhere. And I don't want to drag you into the constitutional issues. It's not about that. It's about how we take forward boosting renewables within Scotland.
And I take the question exactly in the spirit it's intended. I think this is a very good example of a complex area which is made more complex by the mix of devolved and reserve powers that we currently see. We say in the report that the Scottish Government has got ambitious targets that are well linked to its wider policy agenda and that it's doing a lot to make progress towards them. We also are very clear about the parts of UK energy policy that can make that harder. The first is, I think, to do with the access to the national grid and the way in which that works. The second is to do with the charges for transmission for more remote parts of the UK. Mark may want to expand on that further, but in broad terms, what we've done here, because of the limits of my responsibility in auditing the Scottish Government's expenditure and the Scottish Parliament's budget, has been to focus on the existing boundaries of what is devolved, while recognising that that is, you have to look at that in the context of wider UK policy and wider economic factors, like the uncertainty about large financial investments just now. Mark, do you want to pick that up?
Just to pick up on the points about the feed-in tariffs and things, one of the problems that the sector is facing as a whole is uncertainty as to what happens in the future over feed-in tariffs and what their potential replacement might be. And that's tied in with the wider issue of electricity market reform that's going on at the UK level. That's had an impact, as we say in the report, on kind of the pace at which public bodies have been able to spend some of the money which has been made available to them by the government, because that uncertainty is slowing down the rate at which projects are coming on stream. People are waiting to see what happens and how that energy market reform is resolved before committing to projects.
For another committee rather than the audit committee, but just given my constituents' interest, I wanted to put some of that on the record. Thank you, Convener.
Yes, I just wanted to get a bit clearer about the actual jobs. My son is a civil engineer and a project manager for wind farms, but when the wind farms finish, the job is finished. You know, and that's why I do appreciate that it is difficult to get a snapshot at a point in time. Now, given that there were just over 11,000 jobs in March last year, and these included 1,000 in colleges, universities and the public sector, so you're talking just over 10,000. If we go to paragraph 74, and Auditor General mentioned jobs at the beginning, the most optimistic scenario of 40,000 has been used, which is apparently twice as much than the industry is suggesting offshore. But the least optimistic is around 13. Could we maybe just get a little bit of honesty here? It's not going to be 40,000. It isn't 40,000 at the moment. Is it not more likely to be, I mean, there's a big difference between 13 and 40,000, 3 times. Is it nearer the 13,000 that we're looking at? Is 40,000, in your own words, an optimistic scenario?
That certainly is an optimistic scenario, and that's why I'm recommending that the revised forecasts that are due by the end of this year should be more realistic. I think there are 3 things going on there. First of all, the current forecasts do include a number of scenarios, which is good practice. When you're forecasting the future, by definition, you don't know what's going to happen. So having different assumptions and testing them is a good thing. Using the most optimistic one doesn't do justice to the complexity of that planning. Secondly, as we say, there has been a delay in some of the investment that was expected because of the wider uncertainty about the investment required, much of which is outside the government's control and reflects either market conditions or UK energy policy. And the third is that it's not always clear what is a renewable job. Is it
fair to include, you know, almost 1,000 people in colleges, universities and the public sector? Would they lose their jobs if we stop building wind farms?
Let me ask Mark to take you through that. He has focused a lot of attention on this question and I think can give you a better answer than I can.
The 11,000 number is based on survey that Scottish Renewables, who are the organisation that represents the renewable industry in Scotland, collated. They're currently in the process of trying to revise that figure for 2013, and I expect to see that kind of in the next few weeks. As the Auditor General has said, understanding exactly what a renewables job is very hard and very difficult to define. People working for engineering consultancies, divers, maintenance crews and so forth may well be working in the oil and gas industry as well as in other marine renewable environments. That's why when we spoke to the enterprise agents, they said it's even hard to get a kind of really firm handle on exactly what an energy job is, sort of in the wider sense, let alone a renewables job, so lots of the skills are transferable between them.
The nature of the jobs as well has to be taken into account.
We've not got any information on whether these are sort of permanent roles or temporary roles.
Yes. Okay, I'll just move on to my second question, Convener, and it's Exhibit 7, page 23. And first of all, I didn't want to ask it in the college one, but Orkney and Shetland were left out of the colleges, but they're also left out of the public and private sector investment in ports and harbours. So my first question is, we've got the Western Isles, but not Orkney, Shetland. Have they not been investing in their ports and harbours?
The various dots on the map in Exhibit 7 show the 11 ports and harbours that were identified in the National Renewables Infrastructure Plan back in 2010. There was one site on Lewis. There were no sites within that plan in Orkney and Shetland. That's not to say that there's not been investment in ports and harbours in Orkney and Shetland, supported in part by High, but they were outside of the scope of the National Renewables Investment Infrastructure Plan.
Surprised at that, but never mind. Okay, we come to an estimated total of 253 million is needed, and I think the largest investment that's being sought is at Ardesir, just outside Inverness, 36 million. Can you give me an idea where this money is going to come from?
The vast majority of it is anticipated that it will come from private sector investments, building facilities at ports and harbours to allow the development of predominantly offshore wind, but also kind of what the government is hoping, wider marine technologies, wave and tidal facilities. So it's expected that the vast majority will come from the private sector. Taking first the 6 sites which Scottish Enterprise have responsibility for, which are illustrated with the purplish dots on the map. The initial estimates thought that they required £164 million worth of investment to upgrade them to the necessary level. Now, Scottish Enterprise put aside 70 million to try and support that investment, leaving the balance of which to be made from the private sector.
Hunterston is 65 million. That's quite a significant amount from the private sector.
Yes.
And the Highland ones, generally Highland, yes, that would all be met private sector again, which is quite significant. Okay, I'll leave it at that.
Okay, anybody else? Ken McIntosh, I'm going to be short with this session, so Ken McIntosh and Willie Coffey.
Can I just ask, the government and many of us, the rest of us, would support greater community ownership of renewables, but it doesn't seem to have been a phenomenal success so far. You put a comment. There's a bit of a section under page 20. But,
I'll again ask Mark to come in with more detail in a moment. I think that is one of the issues we highlight in here as having been made more difficult by the current economic climate that people are working in. The government does have 2 schemes, CARES and the REIF scheme, which are both intended to help communities to take advantage of the opportunity to invest, if I can put it that way, in renewable schemes in their areas. And they are both slower to take off than the government had expected. I'll ask Mark to talk you through why that's the case.
One of the challenges that projects face is kind of the financing for these projects. The CARES scheme, which the Auditor General kind of made reference to, is controlled to a certain extent by European regulations, and that specifies the kind of interest rates that have to be, or broadly specifies interest rates that have to be charged for these things, which are actually relatively high, reflecting the perceived risk of some of these projects. And communities are less willing perhaps to take on that risk and attract the high interest payments that they have. formerly a lot of these projects were financed by grant funding and that there was no kind of risk associated with doing it, whereas now community groups and perhaps individuals are finding it harder to take on the risk now that they have to raise money from the market.
Did you make a recommendation? You don't seem to make any recommendations there, though, but would you have any recommendations for how greater community ownership could be improved?
We've not made recommendations about that. The government has evaluated the CARES scheme fairly recently, and it has also just changed responsibility for the organisation which runs and delivers the CARES scheme. And they are looking at ways, having taken that on in August this year, they're looking for doing an evaluation of whether they can find ways to make things more accessible to community groups and things. And I'd anticipate them reporting in the relatively near future on that, to see what the best way forward might be to address exactly the issues you raised.
Okay. Do you make an assessment overall about who the main beneficiaries of the renewables expansion has been? In other words, who owns the companies that are actually making the turbines and the wind farms? Who owns the energy that's then produced? Do you make any assessment of that at all?
We haven't made that analysis so far. It's something which I think isn't necessary in terms of looking at progress against the government's targets and the investment that it's made. But clearly in terms of evaluating the wider economic benefit at some point, those are all relevant considerations. They're not things we've looked at as part of this. And again, that evaluation would need to take account of the wider constraints that come from the global trade obligations and our membership of the EU.
Indeed, would be.
Very briefly.
All right. Final question then. It was your recommendation that the government doesn't appear to have a methodology to monitor its target for overall energy demand. Do you think this is a gap?
Not necessarily, but I'll ask Mark to tell you quickly why.
The overall energy demand target of 30% of energy demand coming from renewable sources by 2020 is made up of the heat, the transport and the electricity targets. So, crudely speaking, if you add those three together, you'll get an indication of what overall energy demand is. The government is working on refining the method behind that, and our recommendation is there as an encouragement to them to make sure that they do that. Just by chance, because of those three targets are currently about a third of the way towards it, that means roughly they're about a third of the way towards the overall energy demand target.
Willie Coffey.
Thanks very much, Convener. Auditor General, you mentioned that there were three main messages in your opening, well, your summary there. One about monitoring private sector investment. The other one was on the issue of the 40,000 jobs. But the third one that I wanted to focus on was post-2020 and what the implications are for all of us, for the Scottish Government and the Scottish population. My attention is also drawn to the chart on page 13 there that shows you in quite stark contrast what's happening in terms of the renewables revolution in Scotland compared to the UK, and the electricity generation circle there that I could draw your members' attention to again, where we expect 100% to be generated, electricity to be generated from renewables in Scotland compared to the UK's 30%. Now, going back to your third point about post-2020, is there an opportunity for Scotland and the Scottish Government to further develop the renewables revolution here to capture some of that market and to assist our neighbours down south to help keep their lights on?
I'm not sure I can answer that question directly. The reason for making the recommendation that we have is that in some ways, like housing, the investment needed here is significant upfront investment and it needs to be made over a long period. In any circumstances, but particularly in the current economic climate, it's therefore important that any government gives potential investors as much certainty as they can about their commitment to a particular policy area and the targets that underpin it over a long period of time. The question of how we see our energy supply policy, how it links to energy security, to economic revenue streams is a wider policy question for government that I don't think we're equipped to answer.
Just on the issue, Willie Coffey was asking about sales. On the cost of generating that renewable, have you looked at how much it has cost and what the subsidies are?
You'll see from this report that that's not a major part of what we've done now. I'll ask Mark to talk you through our thinking in that area.
The cost of renewable energy is very much dependent on kind of the maturity of the technology that you're looking at, and there's big efforts being made to reduce the cost per megawatt, for example, for offshore wind, down to a certain level. The technology and the engineering and infrastructure is not there yet, so that's electricity generated there would be more expensive. In technologies which are even earlier in their stage of development, for example, wave or tidal, the cost per unit of electricity is higher still. But that's part of the economic prize that's being sought, is trying to reduce that cost to be able to then market that and sell that expertise more widely.
So if we were aspiring to sell on renewable energy in significant amounts by 2020, it presumably would depend on how much it costs us to produce it and how much the market would be able to sustain.
That's absolutely the case, yes.
Okay. Very interesting report. Thank you very much for that. It certainly throws up a number of challenges for the future. So with that, we will now move into private session.